silver hair reminiscent of moonlight cats, gaze, eyes as blue as the sky on a clear day, a painfully familiar character. Not long ago, a lady read a novel called The Beloved Saint. The main villain was named Liz Agnes. Despite her cold-blooded image, she knew suffering and despair better than anyone else. The character she possessed was named Rachel Agnes. It so happened that she ended up in the body of her favorite heroine's sister. The young lady was very happy because she understood that very soon she would have the opportunity to see the wonderful Liz with her own eyes. The young lady was very happy because she understood that her dreams were coming true. She was very happy, but a moment later she froze in place. She understood that the main character was the illegitimate daughter of a duke who had been a commoner all her childhood. But Rachel, her paternal sister, suddenly came into an inheritance and then died. Afterwards, the girl was accepted into a noble family where she was bullied. As time went on, the young lady's soul became darker and darker, turning the little girl into a real monster. Now everyone could ask themselves why she liked the villain so much more than the main heroine. But the answer was simple. Liz was beautiful and smart. She also managed to awaken magical powers in herself and then crushed all those who mocked her. She remembered what kind of end awaited her sister, and tears came to her eyes. She knew that love was this pure desire to fix someone and have absolute power over them. Unfortunately, she was never able to get what she wanted, but at least she tried. In the end, the young lady had no regrets. She sighed heavily because she knew that if she only knew how to love her, ending could have been completely different. She knew that her sister had not chosen this life. Now she understood perfectly well that she could die of her own free will, no matter what. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that her ending could have been completely different. She knew her sister claimed to have no regrets, but the thought of a different outcome proved otherwise. She knew it would have been much better if she had been able to show her sister a different ending. Her true goal was to live in peace with her sister until she became a gray-haired old woman. For a moment she froze and wondered why in her fantasies she had only outlived herself. Sometime later, her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a maid. The maid greeted her mistress with a grin and said that she had brought her favorite wine. Rachel was glad that she knew all the characters. Thanks to her memories from her past life, she knew what awaited her. The head maid did everything to ensure that her mistress drank this drink. She knew that the head maid had served the family for many years, and she was able to finally drive Rachel crazy, little by little brainwashing her. Taking advantage of the Duchess's mental clouding, she obtained a power of attorney and began to rule the territories as she saw fit. Rachel lost her parents in an accident, after which she was awarded the title of Duchess. It was not surprising that the maid took advantage of this situation. Unfortunately, the maid's plan was successful. Rachel sighed heavily and said that she had a headache from the alcohol, and it would only make it worse. Looking at the maid, she said that the beta took the alcohol back. The maid was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that she would do everything, but she also said that there was no better cure for a headache than sleep. She smiled and said that she would return to the lady after she had rested. Rachel understood perfectly well that the maid wanted to put her to bed, and at that time, she would imagine herself the mistress of the duchy. The Duchess told the maid not to be so importunate. The maid backed away and said that it was her fault, and in that case, she would prepare a bath for her. At this point, the young Duchess is 20 years old, and she has been drinking heavily for 6 months, neglecting her duties. She knew that she first had to get rid of the head maid, who had attacked her sister as soon as she entered the mansion. She sighed heavily because she knew that this was simply ridiculous. She was taking a luxurious bath in a duchy that was going to hell. She sighed heavily as she knew the water was simply wonderful. The maid came slowly to the Duchess and wished her a pleasant bath. Trembling with fear, she said that she thought she could make it better. The young lady froze for a moment as she saw the very wine that the head maid had so persistently tried to pour into her. She looked intently at the maid and angrily asked who had ordered the wine to be brought to her. The maid was taken aback for a moment and froze in place, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the maid fell to the ground with a crash and begged the Duchess to forgive her. The maid said that she had made a terrible mistake, only because she had only recently arrived in the duchy. The young lady looked closely at the maid. She knew she had to start small. She understood perfectly well that she needed to show people that she had changed. She looked at the maid intently and said with a smile that she should not worry, and also asked her name. The maid looked at the Duchess with tears in her eyes, but said that her name was Anne. The Duchess told the maid that she had not yet settled into the estate and would not have been able to think of bringing her wine on her own, and she was simply wondering who had sent her to her. Anne hesitated and timidly said that it was the head maid's order, and she had told her that the Duchess would definitely want a drink. The Duchess looked at the maid with a grin on her face and asked her to give her the bottle. The Duchess looked at the maid intently and said that she could tell the head maid that she liked everything. The maid bowed submissively. The young lady thought for a moment, wondering why the maid was constantly trying to get her to drink this particular wine. She looked closely at the bottle, and a moment later she became furious as she realized what had happened. She knew her mind was a little clouded, and she smelled of hops, but otherwise everything was fine. A moment later the Duchess heard some noise. She sighed heavily, since the morning had only just begun, and there was already some kind of commotion. A moment later, the atmosphere in the room became very tense. She looked at everyone present in surprise, as she did not understand why they were exchanging glances at each other. The man looked at the Duchess intently and said that today she would have to listen to him. Xenia looked at him intently and asked if she understood correctly that he was Marcus. He looked at her intently and said he was amazed that she still remembered his name. She understood perfectly well that she was incredibly lucky since she was going to look for him, but he came to her himself. She knew that he had previously been the late Duke's assistant, and later he had become Liz's right hand. The Duchess looked at him sideways and said with a smile that they could go inside and talk in peace. She understood perfectly well that he was the only one who knew where her sister was now, since it was he who transferred her to the family. She knew that it was he who wanted to make her sister the new Duchess. Marcus looked at her intently and said that it had been 6 months since he had last seen her sober. The Duchess froze for a moment, as he had hit her where it hurt most. She knew she couldn't argue with his words, and Rachel had been drowning her sorrows in wine every day lately. She knew she should be ashamed, but she didn't feel any negative consequences from her lifestyle. She wondered if this was her superpower. She was wary and thought that most likely she was some kind of magician. She sighed heavily because she knew that if things had been this way, then she would not have died so early. She asked what he wanted to talk to her about. He looked at her intently and said that he had brought her documents about the Duke's affairs over the past 6 months. Marcus said that the farmers were left without harvest, and the soldiers and knights had not been paid for several months. He said that the ever-increasing taxes are forcing residents to leave the duchy, and that the number of victims of wild animals near the borders is also increasing. He sighed heavily and said that many had been sharpening their blades for a long time, waiting for the right moment to organize an uprising. She sighed heavily, as she had assumed that things were not going well in the duchy, but she had not thought that things were this bad. The Duchess was puzzled and did not understand how they had come to this. Marcus asked if she had forgotten how she had handed over her powers to the head maid. He looked closely at the Duchess and said that it was the head maid who had looked at all the papers. Marcus said that in fact, the duchy was not run by a duchess, but by some maid. The lady sighed heavily, as she understood that this was a nightmare. The Duchess told Marcus that she needed to get rid of the head maid's minions first. Marcus asked her in surprise if she was serious. She took out a bottle of wine and said that she had one request. He looked at her in surprise and told her to explain. The Duchess looked closely at the bottle and said that it was this one that the head maid had given her, and she wanted him to find out what the wine was made of. She looked at Marcus intently and said that they could confirm it, but something had definitely been slipped into the drink. Marcus was furious. He didn't understand who one had to be, to commit such a mean act. The captain kept shouting and complaining. He didn't understand why they all didn't listen to him. The Duchess could not believe that she was hearing such things from a man who in the near future could become a heartless intriguer. She understood perfectly well that if he had not changed so drastically, he would not have been able to protect her little sister. Marcus looked intently at the Duchess and said that he would certainly do everything. He bowed and said he would return as soon as he had the details figured out. She knew he was not being completely faithful to her. She knew that he was loyal only to his homeland and the dead Duke, but she was glad that one day he would begin to help her sister. The young lady knew that for this reason she could count on him. She knew that he would not let her down. The Duchess understood perfectly well that she had to do everything to ensure a happy future for her beloved sister. Rupert looked at the captain and asked when he would pay the wages of those who had not yet received them. Dale Waver sipped his wine and looked at the knight with disdain. As he was getting back to his old tricks, the captain told the knight to tell everyone else that they had to wait a little longer. He asked angrily how much longer they had to endure. Rupert asked furiously if they should just tighten their belts and continue to work for free. The captain looked at his subordinate with fury and asked if he had forgotten who he was talking to. Rupert knew the captain's brains were soaked in alcohol. He couldn't understand how his family had gotten to this point. The captain slapped his knight across the face with fury, leaving Rupert frozen in shock. Rupert sighed heavily and told the captain to stop immediately. The captain looked at the knight with fury and asked what would happen if he didn't want to do this. Rupert knew that he had to endure. The knights looked at the commander and said that they did not intend to tolerate this, and they were leaving. Dale was in shock. He didn't expect them to leave. The captain looked at them with fury and shouted that they must stop. The captain shouted that if they didn't stop, they would be in trouble. The Duchess looked at them and asked what the captain would do. Then Rupert was taken aback and beamed. Looking at the Duchess, he was surprised. She looked closely at the captain and said that he could be heard from outside. Rachel looked at the captain with a smirk and asked what he was going to do. Rachel stood quietly and looked into the room as it was very noisy. She saw the head maid's cousin. He was a typical example of a man who got everything through connections. She looked intently at his interlocutor, whose name was Rupert Archer. Rupert is a powerful knight who protected the main character, the Saint, in the most dangerous moments. Rachel knew that he was originally part of Agnes's squad. She understood that judging by the current situation today was the day he had to leave the estate. She understood perfectly well that she could not let him go since he was a very outstanding person, and in the future he would achieve the rank of master. She knew that if she didn't hold him back, he would become a nuisance to Liz in the future, so she asked the captain if he really wanted to attack him. The captain looked at her in surprise and asked what brought her to them. The Duchess asked the knight for a chair. The Duchess looked at everyone present and asked the captain what he was waiting for. She said that he could begin. She looked at them intently and said that she didn't care at all what the outcome would be because it wouldn't affect them negatively. Rupert was momentarily taken aback as the aristocrat from a highly respected family made a promise. The captain looked at her warily and asked if she was really not joking. He froze in place for a moment as she looked at him with a teared gaze. He was taken aback because he knew that his sister was stuffing the Duchess with medicine, but for some reason he felt uneasy. Rupert looked at the captain intently and said that he did not want to stain his sword by fighting the captain, and so he would use a wooden one. The captain was furious he insulted his subordinate. The captain rushed at the knight in fury and shouted that he would make him regret everything. The young knight, in turn, masterfully blocked the blows of his captain. The knight captain was taken aback. He did not expect this. The young lady, in turn, watched their duel intently. She looked at the knight intently and said that this was simply terrible. Rupert had made his move. He understood that he wouldn't even be surprised if she went back on her words. She looked closely at the knight and said that from now on, he would be the commander of the knightly squad. The young man froze in shock. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he should now send all the parasites behind bars. She smiled and said that he should do it immediately. The young man beamed with happiness. He looked closely at the Duchess as he realized that she had changed. He did not know what exactly had happened. The young man was shocked and understood that the time they had all been waiting for had already come. He smiled and said that the order would be carried out. The head maid sat in the office and thought she knew that no one suspected that the Duchess was under the influence of a special substance. She knew that everyone thought that the Duchess was mired in sadness and emptiness after the loss of her parents. In fact, it was all thanks to the medicine. She sighed and thought as she didn't like what was happening in the morning at all, because after waking up, the Duchess began to look for alcohol. She knew that addiction was a disease that could not be overcome by desire and will alone. She looked at the maid and asked if the Duchess had said anything. Anne said with a smile that the Duchess had said that she liked everything. The head maid smiled and told the handmaid that if she would follow all her orders, her life would become much easier. Trembling with fear, the maid agreed. The head maid looked at her intently, not understanding why she was unhappy. She understood that the new maid had not yet realized how things were in the estate. She knew that there was nothing to worry about, since it would soon dawn on her. The maid burst into the office and shouted to the head maid that the Duchess had met with the Baron. The head maid was in shock, as the Baron was always putting spokes in her wheels. She knew that the Duchess would not agree to meet with him. The maid was furious. She asked Anne if she had given the wine to the Duchess. Anne tremblingly said that she had given everything. The head maid was furious because the maid did not make sure that the Duchess would drink the wine. She threw a plate at her in anger. The head maid fired the maid. She was furious because she knew she should have gotten rid of the Baron earlier. The Duchess looked at the captain and told him not to let anyone escape from the estate. Looking at the Duchess, he said that he would do everything no matter what it cost him. She hesitated and told him not to take too many risks. The captain said that she need not worry as his name and honor were at stake, and he would definitely do the job assigned to him. She sighed heavily as he was going a bit overboard, and it was even making her nervous. At that moment, the duchy was in a terrible state, and even internally, the detachment of knights experienced it on themselves. Many of those who held important positions were demoted. Many left the estate of their own free will. Then, all the empty places were occupied by the chief servant's minions. The Duchess knew that she had to catch them. She knew very well that her sister had a hard time because of the head maid. She knew that her sister had appeared at the estate exactly 1 year later, and because of all the suffering, the young lady had become an excellent villain. The Duchess understood perfectly well that this would not happen while she was alive. She wanted to lay a path of flowers before her. She knew that, thanks to Liz, she managed to survive that time. She looked at the knight closely and said with a grin that they could start catching insects now. The Duchess started when she suddenly heard a noise outside the door. The head maid burst into the office with lightning speed and looked at the Duchess in surprise. The Duchess looked closely at the head maid and asked what she had been doing in her study while she was gone. The maid was taken aback. She timidly said that she was cleaning. Looking at the Duchess, she said that she had heard something happen outside, and for that reason, she was just heading towards her. The Duchess looked closely at the maid and said that Britannia walked slowly towards her. The Duchess looked intently at the head maid and called her. Rachel slowly began to dry the maid. Looking at the maid, she said that the head maid's place was fine. The Duchess said with a grin that the head maid had now received the jewels and power she had long wanted. Abigail said that she had chosen the jewels for the Duchess. The Duchess smiled and asked if they were all hers. The Duchess looked intently at Abigail and called her. Abigail smiled and told the Duchess that it was hers. The Duchess smiled and thanked the head maid for everything. Abigail looked at the lady in surprise. She was confused and did not understand what was happening, but a moment later, a knight approached her. Abigail was in shock. She did not understand what happened and why the Duchess was treating her like this. Looking at everyone present, Abigail screamed that she had been devoted to the Duchess all this time. After the head maid was taken away by the guards, the Duchess looked at the maid and called her. The Duchess looked at the young servant with a smile and said that she would soon need her help. After Abigail was put behind bars, the servants began to return to them. The first to return were the butler and the former maid. The Duchess promoted her to head maid and gave her a list of chores, and eventually, all the housekeeping was entrusted to the two of them. Meanwhile, the Duchess was drowning in paperwork. In 6 months, taxes had increased several times over. People were leaving the duchy out of fear of taxes. Unfortunately, the streets were teeming with unemployed and homeless people. Crime had increased several times. She wanted Marcus to return as soon as possible. She knew she had to send Marcus to find out what was in that bottle. According to the plot, the Duchess was supposed to die, but she was reborn in her body. The maid informed the mistress that the commander of the knights had returned. The Duchess looked at her knight in surprise and asked if the head maid had really managed to appropriate these valuables in 6 months. He looked hard at the Duchess and said that this was only a part of it. The Duchess looked at him in surprise, as she was simply in shock. The knight said that he simply brought what was lying in plain sight. Everyone was in shock. The Duchess looked at them and said that both of them were from Waver County, which would definitely benefit them and their financial situation. She knew that the only way to get the Waver estate and land was to get a guilty verdict from the court. The Duchess looked at the knight intently and asked if Abigail was still silent. He sighed heavily and said that it was exactly so. He looked at the Duchess and said that she was now being tortured with interrogations, but she was not saying a word. The Duchess knew that Abigail was holding on with all her might because one wrong move could destroy her entire family. Rupert was furious. He shouted that taking someone else's property was a capital crime. He was shocked that Abigail had slipped something to the Duchess. The Duchess looked at the knight intently and asked in bewilderment if that was all for today. Rupert said that he also brought documents for the house in the capital. She saw that Dale Waver bought a house. The Duchess said they should check what his salary was. She looked closely at the knight, for she saw that he was quiet and calm, like a bear. But she knew that he would have to endure a lot in the future. She sighed heavily and said that everyone must have had a hard time because of her. He said that was not true. She was furious because she knew that many people had suffered because of an incompetent head maid. He looked at the Duchess intently and said with a smile that even if there had been such moments, he was sure that it would not happen again. The Duchess looked at him with a smile and said that of course this would not happen again. A moment later she turned around as she heard someone calling her. She looked at Marcus with a smile. As she noticed that he was very late, she looked at him in surprise because he was not himself. She noticed that he seemed to have aged before her eyes. He looked at her intently and shouted at her that she needed to get a medical examination right now. Dante Gerald looked at the master and said that that was all, and they could leave the rest to the Margrave. Looking at the gentleman, he said that it was time for them to return. Among the enemy tribes living on the border, there appeared those whom even the Margrave could not cope with. The name of their leader is Text. He went against tyranny together with his fellow tribesmen. He fought to the end, but before Archduke Lexerville, he was like a butterfly. While the Archduke himself was in charge of defense, no one could invade the empire. Dante said that they received news from the Duchy Agnes 6 months ago. The Duke and his wife died, and then problems began in the estate. He looked at his assistant and asked if the Duchess had really abandoned all her affairs and started drinking every day. He said he heard that some hyenas had set their sights on the duchy. He asked if the place had been devoured entirely. Dante sighed heavily and said that this was not so, and they said that the Duchess had come to her senses and was now settling all her affairs. The Archduke was surprised that the girl had come to her senses. He knew that at every meeting she hid behind the backs of her parents. He knew, of course, what rumors were going around about him. He wondered if she would be able to rule the duchy with such a timid soul. He knew that if a weak man became the head of a family, the ship was destined to sink in deep waters. He sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to return to the capital. The assistant asked in surprise if he wanted to meet with the Margrave. He sighed heavily, for he knew that his master had destroyed, in 1 week, an enemy that others had fought against for over a year. He knew that although his master resolved this kind of problem very quickly, he was terribly uncomfortable. He had the impression that his master was not concerned with other people's destiny, and that it did not affect him in any way. He knew that his master had always been a predator who cared only about prey. The doctor looked at the Duchess and said that she was fine. Rachel asked in surprise what was in the bottle. Rumon Tudos frowned for a moment as he looked at the Duchess, but a moment later he asked her if she knew anything about Pierrot grass. Rachel said she had not heard of it. She looked at the doctor and asked what kind of herb it was. Rumon said, puzzled, that it was a fairly well-known poison. Looking at the Duchess, he said that poison kills the soul, bringing it into such a state that it cannot be reborn again. Rachel was in shock, as she was given such poison to drink. Unfortunately, even experienced doctors and priests could not identify the symptoms of poisoning, because the onset of its action was similar to alcohol addiction. But there was only one difference. If you use it for more than 6 months, then a person will not be able to connect words into complete sentences. The doctor said that this poison was banned by the imperial family. If he had not encountered similar cases before, he would not have understood anything. She understood that if the ban came from the imperial family, then this herb could not be bought anywhere. The Duchess understood perfectly well that she needed to find out as soon as possible where Abigail had managed to get this herb. She asked the doctor how it was that she was healthy, despite the fact that she had been taking poison for more than 6 months. He said he knew that a person could remain sane after taking the poison only under 2 conditions. She looked at the doctor intently and asked what he was talking about. The doctor said that the person must be a saint who has received a blessing from God. He looked at her intently and said that the man must also be a magician with exceptional abilities. She knew that magic could not be awakened by simple training. It appeared only in the chosen ones. The young lady understood perfectly well that there were different elements that a magician could control. She was puzzled and did not know where such strength came from in her. She did not feel anything in her body. The doctor looked at the Duchess intently, but said nothing. He knew that this poison was killing the soul. He looked closely at the Duchess and wondered if he or anyone else had managed to influence her character. The Duchess looked at the doctor and called him. He sighed heavily and said that little was known about this herb, and it was imperative to monitor its condition. She looked at the doctor intently and thanked him with a smile for coming back. He sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness for not having fulfilled their duties to the end. She knew that despite the fact that he had dedicated more than half of his life to her family, he had been thrown out of the estate without any explanation. She knew the duchy was like a second home to him. She wondered how much he hated the duchy and missed it at the same time. She said with a smile that he must have been very tired from the journey. She said that she would call him if she needed him, but for now he could rest. He bowed and said that if she felt anything was wrong, she should immediately contact him. A moment later, a maid entered the room. The Duchess looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. She looked at the lady with a smile and said that from everything that had come to her, she had chosen the most important. The Duchess froze for a moment as she saw the letter from the imperial family. Dale looked at his sister and said that all this happened because of her. She looked at him puzzled and said that he came himself and agreed to all the conditions. The knights were furious. They did not understand what their guilt was and why they should sit in prison. Abigail knew that the Duchess would not execute them because she was from a noble family. She knew that when the trial began, they would have to present concrete evidence, but almost no one knew about the drug. She knew she would simply insist that she was innocent. She didn't understand why the Duchess was okay, since she had been giving her poison for a long time. The knight looked at Abigail and told her to go out as the Duchess ordered. Abigail smiled and said that the Duchess seemed to believe in her loyalty. The knight sighed heavily, for he knew that they were mistaken. He knew full well that Abigail would not see the light of day for a long time. After all, her ladyship gave the order to solve the problem, in a place where even a rat could not penetrate. Marcus shouted to the Duchess that Theo von Lexville was a completely crazy person. She froze in shock, not knowing what to answer. She knew that his family had been firebenders for generations. She knew that magic was not hereditary. His entire family had somehow awakened the power of fire within themselves. In return, they were forced to become hunters, spending their lives in fierce battles. Some called it the curse of blood. She had one specific reason why she remembered all this. The imperial family hosted a banquet in honor of the Duke's victory in the war. She knew that after the main male character became emperor, the current archduke was soon buried. She looked at the assistant and asked if she could not take part. He sighed heavily and said that she knew the answer herself. He shouted that they would have no other chance to inform everyone about the return of the Agnes family. He looked closely at the lady and said that if she was worried about the Archduke, then maybe she should just not approach him. She sighed heavily because she felt uneasy knowing what kind of end awaited him. She knew that the current emperor was the protagonist's uncle who would punish him in the future. She read in the document that the imperial family had imposed a ban on the sale of Pierrot's herb. She sighed heavily as she felt somehow uneasy. She was puzzled and very tired. She glanced sideways at the assistant and asked if he had anything to tell her. Marcus looked at the lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that she was talking about a girl named Liz Agnes. He had never seen the Duchess so sure of every word she said that she knew that he knew where the girl was. He didn't understand why she suddenly decided to find her half-sister. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was asking why she couldn't turn a blind eye to the fact that her sister lived on the street. He looked at her intently and asked if she could make him a promise out of respect for the previous duke. He knew that the current state of affairs in the domain left much to be desired, and he wanted to wait until everything got better. Rachel looked at her assistant with a beaming smile and said that they simply loved their job. He looked intently at the young Duchess as he did not understand what she was planning at all. He wondered if she had good intentions. When asking about her sister, he knew that aristocrats usually left an illegitimate child to rot in the streets. The young lady knew that over the past 6 months, taxes in their duchy had increased several times. Because of this, the people's peaceful life ended, and it was then announced that everyone would be exempt from taxes for the next quarter. He said that most people couldn't read, so he hired some people to spread the word. Marcus looked at her intently and said that soon everyone would find out. She frowned and thought. She thought for a moment about the education of the people she wanted to think about creating an academy later. She knew that she had to create a comfortable environment for her sister to grow in. And for that, she had to become stronger. She knew that in this life, she would do everything to ensure that her sister found happiness. The Duchess understood perfectly well that first of all she needed a lot of money. The things that once belonged to the senior maid had to be sold secretly, which is why they were only able to get half the amount due. But she knew that the little crumbs still helped to increase the budget of their duchy a little. She smiled and said that it was time to finish up with business for today. Marcus began checking the documents, looking at the Duchess. He said that he approved all her documents. She was very happy that he approved her documents, which she had been working on all day. She smiled and said that in honor of this, she should go for a walk. He asked in surprise where she was going. The Duchess said that she personally had to check the state of her property. Marcus said that it was too early to inspect the territory. She looked at her assistant intently and pitifully. He sighed heavily because he knew that he simply shouldn't give in to her charm. She looked at him with a pitiful look. He sighed heavily and agreed with her because he knew that this would be her experience. Rachel screamed as the carriage hit a rock. She was in shock. Anne was surprised, as it was the first time she had ridden in such a comfortable carriage. The Duchess was shocked. She knew that as soon as she saved up a large sum of money, she would certainly sort out all the problems of the local roads. Now she was pretending to be a middle-class aristocrat. The Duchess decided to visit the market on the territory of the duchy. She knew that it was an excellent place to learn about the economic situation. She froze for a moment as she caught a sour smell that was wafting towards her. She noticed the unsightly food. She was shocked because the goods were of low-quality supplies, were difficult because many merchants left the Duke, which was due to the increase in taxes. She was puzzled because she realized that things were much worse than she thought. She was furious because she realized that there were many problems that she needed to solve as soon as possible. A moment later, they noticed a brother and sister selling flowers. The boy looked at his sister with tears in his eyes and said that they seemed to be ignored and that they had not sold a single flower. The girl smiled and told her brother that things were hard for everyone right now, but he shouldn't cry. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise, as she had gone somewhere. The Duchess looked at the young people and said that she would like to buy all the flowers from them. She asked how much they cost. The girl said that this basket would cost 5 silver coins, but since she was taking everything, she would give her a discount. Looking at the Duchess, she said that she would give her the whole basket for 3 gold pieces. The Duchess looked at her with a smile. The girl froze in shock as she saw a whole wallet filled with coins. The Duchess said with a smile that the flowers were wonderful and worth the money. The boy looked at the Duchess in surprise and called his sister. Looking at his sister, he said that the angel girl bought all her flowers. The Duchess took notice of them because their relationship seemed very warm to her. She looked at her subordinates and said with a smile that she would like to give them flowers. They were surprised, as it was the first time they had received such flowers from her. The Duchess asked the knight if he really didn't have a lady love. He said, puzzled, that he didn't even have time to train. The maid smiled and said that she didn't need anyone either because she was busy with her work. The Duchess froze for a moment as she realized that they had no privacy because of her. She knew that once the situation improved, she would send them on vacation. A moment later, they were taken aback as they heard someone scream loudly. The man was furious. He did not understand what the Duchess was doing. He said that under the previous Duke, there was nothing like this. She heard them talking about taxes in the neighborhood. They wanted to drop everything and leave. The maid was surprised, looked at them, and said that the Duchess had issued a decree exempting everyone from paying the tax. The man looked at her in surprise. He was furious and said that the newly elected tax collectors were going from house to house and taking away their last money. The Duchess was shocked. A moment later, they turned around as they heard someone screaming frantically. The man shouted at the girl that if she earned it, she should pay them. The girl begged them to stop. The boy, with tears in his eyes, shouted at them not to touch his sister. The Duchess froze in shock. She was confused and did not know what was happening. The Duchess said she did not elect people to such positions. Rupert said that was exactly the case. She was surprised and didn't understand what was going on. She came closer to them and told them to stop immediately. The knight looked at her in surprise. He said that she seemed to be from a wealthy family and asked her not to get underfoot while others were working. She sighed heavily as she realized that the social order was unstable. She was puzzled as she could not even think of such a thing. The Duchess understood that it was entirely her fault. The girl looked closely at the young people. She understood that it was very dangerous now. She could not allow others to suffer because of her. She looked at her brother intently and told him to run away immediately. He looked at her in surprise, with tears in his eyes, as he did not want to let her go. A moment later, the girl screamed and rushed towards the man who was extorting money from her. The Duchess froze in place. In surprise, she had not expected such a thing. The girl shouted to the young lady that men were dangerous, and she had to save herself quickly. The maid watched everything that was happening with tears in her eyes. Rupert was furious. She knew that when the moment of danger comes, the true nature of a person comes out. She called her knight. The young man looked at the young lady with a grin and asked if she had really lost her fear. The commander of the knights looked at the young man with fury. The Duchess told her knight not to kill them. She sighed heavily and said that she did not want to see such a terrible sight. He said with fury that he would do everything. A moment later, he attacked the young man and disarmed him. The commander of the knights was very agile in his actions. With the speed of lightning, he found himself behind the back of the extortionist. The Duchess looked at the girl with a smile and asked if she was okay. The young man shouted and said that they were alike, not afraid of the Duchess. He said that she would not leave it like that. The Duchess, with a grin, told him not to make her laugh. Anne shouted with lightning speed for everyone to be quiet and quickly pay their respects to the Duchess. The Duchess smiled, for she knew that despite her age, Anne had played her part admirably. The young people looked at the Duchess in surprise. They were shocked and did not expect this. The Duchess smiled and asked her commander of the knights how they could punish the young men. Rupert looked at them with fury and said that they could execute them immediately. The young people were in shock. They did not expect this and prayed for salvation. The Duchess sighed heavily as she looked at everything that was happening. A moment later, she looked around and shouted that she was exempting everyone from paying the tax. She said that the decree had already been issued. The Duchess turned and looked intently at the young girl. She asked her name. The girl smiled and respectfully introduced herself. Bella thanked the Duchess for helping her. The Duchess, in turn, looked intently at the young girl. A moment later, she asked Bella with a gentle smile if she wanted to come with her. Bella froze in surprise for a moment as she didn't expect this. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady, for she knew that she would become her sister's personal servant. The next day, after inspecting the territory, the young lady met with her assistant. She looked at him intently and said that, unfortunately, not all people were informed, and the extortionists continued to operate. She sighed heavily and, looking at Marcus, said that the world outside was very dangerous, and he still did not want to say where her sister was. She sighed heavily because she understood that he still did not believe her. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that they could do it differently. He looked at her in surprise, as if he did not understand what was happening. She smiled and said that she had finished all the business the Duchess said, with a smile that she thought that was enough to solve the problems of the duchy. She looked at her assistant with a predatory gaze and said that now he must keep his promise. The young lady was glowing with happiness, as she knew that she would soon be able to see her beloved sister. Anne looked at the Duchess and carefully covered her with a blanket, and also told the Duchess to rest a little. The Duchess sighed heavily, as she could not sleep at all. Marcus, in turn, thought that it would take her a month to review all the papers. He was surprised that each document was carefully studied. He looked at the Duchess intently, because he knew that this commanded respect. Marcus knew that in front of him now stood the man to whom he would henceforth be devoted. The Duchess grew up in turn, very much wanted to meet her sister, and worked hard, sacrificing her precious sleep. The maid looked at the Duchess with a smile and said that she was probably very worried. The Duchess smiled and said that of course it was all true, because she would soon have a family. The maid looked intently at the Duchess, but said nothing. She knew that after the Duchess lost her parents, she was left alone. Anne sighed heavily, as she now realized that the Duchess was very hard. Anne looked at the Duchess in surprise and called her, as she saw that she simply froze in place. For some time, the Duchess stood in front of a small mirror, greeting her sister. She was very nervous. Marcus looked at her intently and asked if he should enter the house first. The Duchess looked at him intently and said that he didn't need to do it at all, and that she would do it herself. She looked intently at Marcus, not noticing anything around her. She froze in shock for a moment as she saw the young girl hit her in midair. She froze in shock and surprise as she saw her little sister sitting and crying on her lap. The Duchess was puzzled. She could not utter a word and only gently stroked her sister's head. Man is a very fragile creature. He tries to survive by any means in order to satisfy his desires. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand why everything came so easily to the saint. She knew that she didn't have to get her hands dirty to get everything she wanted. The young lady, in turn, never received from others the warmth with which the saint was so freely bestowed. She never felt or knew what peace was. The Duchess looked at her sister in surprise as she did not expect such a meeting. A moment later, she greeted her with a smile. The girl didn't answer. She just looked at her pitifully. She looked at the Duchess in surprise, as she saw that she had the same hair. A moment later, she pulled away from her, realizing that she had made a mistake. The Duchess looked at her with a gentle smile and said that there was nothing to worry about, and if she wanted, she could touch her hair again. The Duchess looked at her with a smile and said that she had the same silver hair as she did. Liz was taken aback and, looking away from the Duchess, said that her hands were dirty. A moment later, they turned their gaze to the side as they heard the woman screaming furiously. She was furious and screaming at the girl not to show up on her doorstep again. The woman looked at the Duchess in surprise and asked who she was. The Duchess looked at the woman in surprise, as she did not understand why she was screaming. She looked at her with fury and said that she was Liz's sister. 8 years ago, when all the flowers in the garden were in bloom, a child was left near the gate. Along with the child was a small note. The woman wrote that she would work hard and send the girl money every month. She asked to take care of the child so that the girl would be healthy. The Duchess walked slowly with her sister to the carriage. The woman looked at them intently. She, of course, suspected that the girl was the illegitimate child of some titled family. The woman looked at them with fury, as she understood that the girl was not simple. She knew that if she tried really hard, she could shake a considerable amount of money out of her. The Duchess looked at the woman and said that she would like to thank her for looking after Liz all this time. The woman looked at the Duchess with a smirk. Although she was not very bright, she was sure that this was an indecently rich family. She understood that this was obvious because she was able to hire knights for herself. The Duchess looked at the woman with cold fury and said that she thought she wouldn't do it. The woman laughed wildly, looking at the Duchess. She looked at the Duchess intently and asked with a grin if she was really the girl's older sister. The woman said that the girl was just being capricious, and she decided to scold her. The Duchess looked at the woman with fury and told her to shut her mouth immediately. The Duchess asked her assistant if he hadn't told her that he sent money every month for her sister's upkeep. Marcus looked at the Duchess and said that it was true, because after the death of the previous owner, he sent funds from his own pocket. He sighed heavily and said that the last couple of months had been very busy. She knew perfectly well that it had only been a few months since her money stopped coming in. She looked closely at her sister because she understood that the girl had started to be hurt much earlier. She knew that one look would be enough to understand this. The knight looked intently at the Duchess and said that he was awaiting her order. The Duchess looked at her sister and asked with a soft smile if she wanted to go with her. Liz froze for a moment and looked at Rachel in surprise and asked if she was really her sister. The Duchess smiled and said that it was true because they were very similar. She looked at the little lady and said that their hair and eyes were the same. Liz froze for a moment as she felt the warmth that she had dreamed about for so long. The Duchess looked at her sister and extended her hand to her with a smile. She wanted to give her all her warmth. She saw the little fragile girl. She knew that Liz had never felt calm before this moment. Liz looked down and asked her sister if she really wanted to take her away, even if she was weird. The Duchess looked at her with a tender smile and said that it made no difference to her. She told her sister that if she wanted to stay close to her, then she would put up with anything. The young lady froze in surprise for a moment. She had not expected anything like this at all. But she still came closer to her sister and took her hand. The Duchess looked at her sister with a tender smile and said that it was time for them to return home. They walked slowly to the carriage. The Duchess turned around and called her knight. She said that he must immediately sort everything out. The knight, in turn, quietly said that he would sort it out completely. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady. She saw that the girl was very small and thin. She knew that the novella described the young lady as living an ordinary life, as a commoner, but she was puzzled because she couldn't call it ordinary. The Duchess was furious. She knew she could not allow her sister to live like this any longer. She knew that at that moment, when she really wanted to give up, it was Liz who took her hand and encouraged her. She knew that her very existence was a miracle. The Duchess was very interested in what kind of life she lived, in a world unknown and alien to her. Rachel wondered what her current sister had been through. She looked closely at her new lady and said with a smile that everything would be fine, and that she would definitely be fine now. The Duchess looked at her sister, and she now understood how full she felt just by watching another eat. She looked closely at her sister because she knew that she was just a sweet girl. There are always several types of dishes on the table of aristocrats, depending on what kind of dish it is. It is served in a special dish, and they are all consumed differently. She was glad that she asked to prepare something simple in advance, because her sister does not know about it. The Duchess was very pleased that her sister could enjoy various dishes without any worries. Aristocrats were accustomed to keeping things that they valued: fountain pens, clothes, toys from childhood, and the Duchess herself was among them. Her old clothes fit her little sister perfectly. The Duchess looked at her sister with a smile and said that she would soon buy her some suitable clothes. A moment later there was a knock on their door. The Duchess looked closely at Bella and said with a smile that now in front of her was the girl she would serve. The young lady in turn looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. Bella looked closely at her new owner with a happy smile on her face. Bella bowed with a smile and introduced herself to the young lady. Liz sighed heavily and said that she was not amiss. The Duchess looked at her sister with a smile and said that she was faithful. She was not used to it yet, but soon everything would be fine. Rachel told her sister that they could go somewhere together. She smiled and told her sister that she would like to give her a gift in honor of her arrival. A moment later they came out of the room, and the young lady stood frozen in surprise as all the servants greeted her, and at the end of the room she saw a large cake. The Duchess looked at her sister and smiled and thanked her for agreeing to live with her. Liz was stunned to the spot. She looked intently at her sister and, bursting into tears, asked why she had come for her so late. The Duchess sighed heavily and said timidly that unfortunately she had been very ill. She had no desire to justify herself with the real Duchess's crimes, but she knew she had no choice. She sighed heavily and, hugging her sister, said that unfortunately she could not come to her earlier as she was very ill. She knew that it was a lie. After all, the real owner of this body died without ever knowing about the existence of her sister. She knew that this was what was supposed to happen in the story, but she decided to lie to her sister and say that she was sick. The Duchess looked at her sister with a smile and a moment later showed her her new room. Liz froze for a moment in surprise. The Duchess asked her sister with a smile if she liked the new room. The young lady looked at her sister with admiration and said that she liked everything. Rachel smiled and told her sister that she was very glad that she liked everything. She said that if Liz needed anything, she should definitely tell her about it. She looked at her sister in surprise and froze for a moment. She smiled a soft smile and said that it was the first time she had been told the word thank you. She said with a smile that she had learned what a cake was, and it turned out to be very tasty. Liz said that now she had enough of everything, and she was very happy. The Duchess knew that warm words, beautiful things, delicious food were all new to her. She looked closely at her sister and wondered where she came from. So sweet and affectionate. The Duchess hugged her sister tenderly. Liz looked at her sister intently and said that she would like to ask her one question. She was surprised and did not understand why the Duchess was so kind to her. Liz looked at her sister intently and said in all seriousness that she didn't know what kind of child she really was. Her real name is Park Ye-an. She was a promising actress, but no matter how brightly a star shines, there comes a time when it fades, and her star faded faster than others. She debuted at an early age and was showered with love by everyone, but due to her constant failures in projects, people began to laugh at her. After she lost all the love of the public that was bestowed upon her, she fell into deep despair, in which she sank. So soon she began to avoid reality. In the vastness of the internet, she met her shining star. Liz said that she pretended to be a polite person, trying to save face. Only those who are not so eager to achieve what they want can do. She said that it made no difference to her when it came to what she needed. She did not disdain anything and achieved what she wanted. She said that the girls that His Majesty should not even see their shadow. The young lady was surprised, as she understood that to some extent, Liz had helped her during difficult times. The Duchess looked at her sister and said with a smile that perhaps she would not understand her, but she must know that she was her star. The Duchess understood that her sister was very strong, unlike her, and she always spat on other people's opinions and did what she wanted. She knew that life only gains true value when you begin to love. Knowing that all her suffering was in vain, knowing that she was approaching the edge of the abyss and was there supporting her, Rachel hugged her sister tightly. She knew that all that long time spent alone, only she saved her. She knew that her sister had become the meaning of her life. She saw before her a child who shone brighter than anyone else. She knew that no matter what trials came her way, she would always be there for her. A week had already passed since the young lady's arrival at the estate, although it seemed that she was still not used to it. But at least she began to smile and shine more brightly than at their first meeting. The Duchess was glad because she knew that her efforts were not in vain. She wanted very much to always be close to her dear sister, but she had to show the high society that Rachel was still alive and well, and for that, she had to go to the banquet in honor of the Lexville victory. The young lady slowly got into the carriage and sighed heavily. She knew that she had only recently met her sister, and now it was very difficult for her to leave her alone for a long time. She knew she could just show up at the banquet and then go home straight away. She froze for a moment as she heard her sister's voice. She quickly looked out of the carriage. The Duchess stood frozen for a moment in surprise as she saw her sister running towards her. Liz ran as fast as she could towards her sister, but unfortunately she tripped and fell to the ground with a thud. Liz looked at her sister with a radiant smile and wished her a good journey. The Duchess looked at the young lady with a radiant smile. At the banquet, everyone was whispering and talking about the Duchess, who had fallen into the embrace of wine 6 months ago. Everyone was wondering what she looked like now. Some time later, everyone was informed that the Duchess had arrived. Everyone present froze in place in surprise. The Duchess, in turn, looked intently at everyone present. The Duchess sighed, for she knew that their faces now looked as if they expected to see a beggar woman. She looked at everyone present with a satisfied smile, because knowing this, she had already gone through all the circles of hell while getting herself in order. The young lady walked slowly up to the Duchess and said with a grin that they had not seen each other for a long time, calling her lady, but a moment later she was taken aback and said with a grin that she should now address her as Her Grace. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady as she noticed that she was very beautiful. She thought that most likely Caroline Harrisman was standing in front of her now. Family helped actively promote the current emperor when he was the crown prince. Thanks to these merits, the titled Marquesses Harrismans became dukes. She knew that once the original plots began to come to fruition, they and the emperor would be lost in the depths of history. She knew that she had no need to get close to them, but they would still be in power for a few more years, so she needed to keep in touch. She smiled and asked the young lady how she sang along, and with tears in her eyes, she said that nothing new had happened between them. She sighed heavily and said with tears in her eyes that her father still told her to stop daydreaming about him. The Duchess looked at her in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. All the ladies present looked at her intently and said that she must be having a hard time. The Duchess knew that the story of the unrequited love of the socialite was quite well known in high society. She knew that this remained in the memory of the real Rachel, who almost never attended aristocratic events. The young lady looked at her closely and said that they thought such a man was not suitable for a person like her, and most likely her father thought so too. The Duchess knew that the object of the unrequited love of the girl who considered herself the main character was the Archduke himself. Caroline sighed heavily and said that I understand perfectly well that her father cares about her. The Duchess was well aware that the young lady had devoted herself to the man who was the center of all attention at this banquet. Caroline sighed heavily and said with tears in her eyes that she could not so easily renounce her feelings for the young man. The Duchess sighed heavily, looking at the young lady, but did not answer. She was well aware that Caroline was almost always trying to attract everyone's attention with her sadness. The Duchess was a little surprised, as she understood that this manipulation on the part of the young lady had worked. All the men who were present at the banquet wanted to console her as best they could. The girls, in turn, felt sorry for the young lady and tried to understand her situation. The Duchess, in turn, sighed heavily and looked intently at the young lady. She knew that the young lady was avoiding other people's judgments and trying to play on two fronts. Caroline, in turn, looked at the Duchess with surprise on her face. She did not understand her reaction. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady she had previously worked in the media industry, and people like her saw every day. But a moment later she turned around, as everyone present was informed that the Emperor had arrived at the banquet, along with the Archduke. The Duchess, in turn, looked intently at the current emperor. Next to him, she saw a young man. It was the Archduke himself. Caroline, in turn, looked at the Archduke with admiration. The Duchess was a vague memory of the body's previous owner and remembered that the Archduke was very attractive. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not thought at all that he would be so handsome. She glanced sideways at the young lady, as she understood that her unrequited love was entirely justified. She was surprised and wondered how he could have been involved in what was said about him. For a moment she froze in place, as she was blinded by his beauty. But a moment later she screamed at herself in her mind that she had to come to her senses. She understood perfectly well that she should now appear before the Emperor and not look at the face of a handsome young man. She knew that Harrisman was the one going to the audience first, and in the hierarchy, she will be next. She saw how Caroline stared at the Archduke. The Duchess sighed heavily, as she knew that the young lady was about to burn a hole in the Archduke with her gaze. She sighed heavily, as she knew it was her turn, and a moment later someone pushed her. She glared at the man, who was looking at her with a smirk. The man looked at the Duchess with a grin, and said that he did not expect to meet her at all. A moment later, Madame appeared from behind the man, and looking at the Duchess with a grin, asked how she had chewed. The Duchess looked at them closely. She knew that this was the family of the Marquis of Cavendish. They tried to conflict with the previous Duke at every opportunity. She knew that she should not get involved with them and get into trouble. The Marquis looked closely at the Duchess and said with a grin that she had not yet had a single official reception with the Emperor. He looked at her with a smirk and asked what she would do if she made any mistake in front of the Emperor. He said that first they would go and introduce themselves, and she could watch them and gain a little experience. The Duchess listened to them silently. A moment later she laughed. She looked at them intently and said that she thought she shouldn't follow the example of people who don't know what hierarchy is. The Marquis and his wife froze in place in shock and surprise. The Duchess turned around with lightning speed. She decided to leave their company. She understood that they just wanted to hurt her. A moment later, she slowly walked up to the Emperor and greeted him and introduced herself. The Emperor looked at her intently and said with a smile that he was very glad to meet her. She glanced sideways at the Archduke and also congratulated him on his victory. The Archduke looked at the Duchess in surprise, but said nothing. She looked at him intently, with a gentle smile on her face, as he seemed to her somehow dangerous. The young lady, in turn, thought that it would be enough for him that she simply greeted him. The Emperor looked at her closely and asked how she was feeling, because he had heard that she had taken the loss of her parents hard. She smiled and asked for forgiveness for making him worry. The Duchess said that from now on she would take responsibility for her affairs and promised to do her duty. She said that he need not worry about such things. He looked at her in surprise for a moment, and then said that since she said so, he had nothing to worry about. The Duchess looked at the Emperor in surprise, wondering if he had just looked her over from head to toe. She knew that now, before her, was the Emperor who had imprisoned his little nephew and taken the throne. She also saw the Archduke, who was going crazy from the smell of blood. She sighed heavily because she didn't want to get involved with them at all. She wanted to go home as soon as possible. But a moment later she was taken aback as she realized that someone had pushed her. She remembered that her assistant had told her that she must remember one thing, that she must not touch the Archduke at all. She looked at him in surprise and asked what would happen if she disobeyed. He did not answer her. The young lady was taken aback and trembling with fear, asking the assistant what would happen. He looked at her and said that she would either be left without an arm or without a head. A moment later, she fell into the Archduke's arms. The young lady froze in shock, and the banquet hall was in turmoil as the Archduke used his power on the Marquis. The young lady sighed heavily. She was deep in her thoughts. She was very sad as she already missed her sister. She understood perfectly well that the most important thing was that all her limbs were intact. She looked at the Archduke intently and asked for forgiveness. He looked at her in bewilderment but did not answer. She understood that the Archduke had not killed everyone left and right since she had survived. But she saw how the Marquis and his wife looked at her with a grin and contempt. The Archduke looked at the Marquis with fury and asked how he dared to use him for his dirty deeds. With lightning speed, he used his magic on the Marquis. The Marquis was in shock. He cried out in pain. His hand was burned by terrible magic. The Duchess, in turn, looked at everything that was happening with her mouth open. She was in shock. She sighed heavily as she realized that the rumors were not lying after all. The Archduke looked intently at the Duchess. A moment later, the Archduke told his knight that they were turning back. She looked after him with bewilderment because she did not understand why he looked at her like that. Liz sighed heavily because as soon as she woke up, she became afraid that her dream could become reality again. But she was also afraid that reality could be just a dream. But still, she was in a warm, cozy room, which was warmed by the sun's rays in the morning. She covered herself with a soft and warm blanket. She sat in silence, and only here could she be alone with herself. She liked the fact that something had appeared in her life that had not been there before. She wanted this place to be her home forever. A moment later, she heard the voice of her maid and hurried to the door. She slowly opened the door and froze in place. Bella looked intently at the maids and said that she did not care what they would say about her, but they should apologize for the words spoken to the young lady. The maid looked at Bella with a smirk and said that the girl was just an illegitimate child, and she would not apologize to her. Bella looked at them with fury and said that they were crossing all boundaries. The maid looked at Bella with a smirk and said that if the Duchess really valued her sister, she would not have hired someone like her because she didn't really know how to do anything. As she left, the maid told Bella to know her place and that she shouldn't get too cocky. Bella, in turn, looked at them with fury but didn't answer. A moment later, the young lady came out of the room and looked at the maid intently. Bella was taken aback as she did not expect to see the young lady so early. Liz looked closely at her personal maid with a smile on her face. Bella backed away and, looking at the lady, asked if she had really heard everything. A moment later, the maid asked her mistress for forgiveness. She sighed heavily and said that because she was not good enough, the young lady was having a hard time. The young lady, in turn, quickly threw herself into the maid's arms. Liz looked at her maid intently and said with a smile that she was very glad that there was a person like Bella next to her. Bella looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes and called her. Liz looked at the maid with a smile and asked if she was okay. Bella looked at her mistress in surprise, but a moment later she said with a smile that everything was fine with her. Of course, because much worse had happened to her. She looked closely at the lady and asked with a smile how she felt. The young lady smiled and said that she was okay because she had been through worse. They looked at each other smiling for a while. Bella looked at the mistress and said that they could come into the room and she would make her bed. The young lady smiled and said that she had already made the bed. Bella was surprised, since that was not the mistress's job at all. With lightning speed, Bella entered the young mistress's room. Liz, in turn, looked furiously after the maids. Anne looked at her hostess with tears in her eyes. She was simply shocked by her news. The Duchess, in turn, sighed heavily and wondered if she was really alive. Unfortunately, she had side effects from yesterday's banquet. She remembered how he looked at the Marquise with fury. She remembered what words he spoke to him. She realized that he had guessed that with his help, the Marks were trying to give her into the dirt. She saw that the Archduke was so emotionless, so she decided that he did not understand anything. She knew that the Marquise family got what they deserved, but she was surprised and did not understand how he could do such a thing in front of the Emperor. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said with a smile that she had finished everything. The young lady was shocked. She didn't understand how he could hurt another person without feeling guilty about it. She knew she had better stay away from him. The maid looked closely at her mistress as she saw that she was depressed. Anne looked at her mistress with a joyful smile and said that since they were in the capital, she could buy herself something. The Duchess looked at the maid in surprise. The maid smiled and said that she could buy some gift for the young miss. Anne said that the young lady would definitely be happy with the gift. Sometime later, the Duchess was already walking with a gift for her sister. She slowly gave the gift to her sister, the maid, sighing heavily. The Duchess said that she wanted to buy everything that was sold in the store. The young lady looked at the Duchess with a radiant smile and said that she never thought that she would be able to meet her in such a place. The Duchess looked at the young lady in surprise as she noticed that there were many people behind her. She wondered if they were all her admirers. She sighed heavily as she understood that the lady loved everyone's attention. The lady smiled and said that she wanted to go to many places as she had not seen her friends for a long time, so it was a pity to arrive in the capital and immediately leave. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady as she was sucking the energy out of her with her conversation. The lady looked at the Duchess intently and said with a grin that their meeting was fateful. She smiled and asked the Duchess if she would like to join them. She smiled and said that they wanted to have a small banquet at the Harrisman estate. She looked at the Duchess with a grin and said that she would be glad if she were present at their celebration. The Duchess, in turn, looked intently at the young lady and said nothing. For the others, she prepared tea, and for the young lady Duchess, she prepared a glass of wine. Caroline looked at the Duchess with a smirk and said that she thought the Duchess liked it here, so she put the wine down. She asked with a smirk if something was wrong. The Duchess looked at the young lady with fury, for she knew that she had liked it. She looked at the young lady with cold fury and said that she was glad that the young lady had thought of her after all. Caroline said, smiling and with tears in her eyes, that this was very good, as she was very worried that she had done something wrong. She looked closely at the Duchess and asked if everything had been all right since last night. The young man looked at the Duchess and said with a smile that the young lady was very worried about her. The young man smiled and told the Duchess that she had nearly been hurt yesterday. The lady smiled and said that the Duchess had a very bad reputation. The Duchess glared at them, but said nothing. She knew they weren't worried about her at all. Rachel knew Caroline was up to something, and that was the reason she was being so nice to her. The Duchess smiled and thanked everyone present for their concern. She smiled and said that, as they could see, everything was fine with her, so they had nothing to worry about. Caroline smiled and asked the Duchess if she knew the Archduke. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that they had met a couple of times at official meetings. Caroline was taken aback for a moment and said that it was very strange because he had never been like that before. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady. She understood that the lady wanted to know why he had not attacked her in a fit of anger. The Duchess wondered if this oddity had really disappointed her so much. Caroline looked at the young Duchess and said that she had long been interested in the Archduke, and for this reason, she thought that there was something between them that she did not know about. Caroline was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. Everyone present rushed to her. They were very excited. They looked intently at the young lady and said that the Archduke knew perfectly well about her feelings, and everyone knew perfectly well that she had been in love with him for a very long time. The Duchess, in turn, sat quietly and dried them. Caroline looked at everyone present with a smile and thanked them for their comfort. She smiled and said that she was being threatened by very kind people, and she thought she was the luckiest person. The Duchess, in turn, looked intently at the young lady and laughed. Caroline looked at the Duchess in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. The Duchess looked at the young lady with cold fury and asked if she really needed to apologize for being unharmed. She looked at the lady intently and asked if that was what she really wanted to say. The young man, in turn, was taken aback by the smile and said that that was not what we were talking about now. Caroline looked at everyone present with a smile on her face and said to the Duchess that she should forgive everyone present for their rudeness. She said that they must have been scared when they saw her tears. The Duchess, in turn, knew perfectly well that she did not need to establish connections with the Harrisman family, but she knew perfectly well that if she appeared in a bad light, now her sister would have a hard time in society. The Duchess looked at the young lady with cold fury and asked if she had completely forgotten her rudeness. She had no intention of poking the young lady in the eye. She pushed the glass away, and it fell to the ground with a crash. The butler looked at the Archduke intently and asked if he had finished his business. Theo looked calmly at the butler and asked if nothing had happened. The butler smiled and said that everything was calm in the palace. Dante looked closely at the gentleman and asked him to be a little more decent. He asked the Archduke, embarrassed, if he wasn't even ashamed. Theo looked at everyone present and said that this was his palace and he could leave as he wished. The butler looked at the Archduke's assistant with a smile and said that the Archduke could walk as he wanted. Arthur looked at everyone present with a grin and said that he liked it. Dante looked at her master with irritation and told him to stop causing trouble. He did not understand why his master had set fire to the Marquise's hand. Theo looked at his assistant closely and said that he did not start this conflict, and the Marquis wanted to use it to his advantage, sighed heavily and said that it seemed like he had several lives, and he should be more careful. Dante was furious. He shouted that the more time passed, the worse the rumors about Theo became. Arthur smiled and said he thought everything was fine. Dante was furious. He hit Arthur on the head with lightning speed, and he fell to the ground with a crash. Theo looked at them intently and asked them to calm down. He said that they needed to do something. The Archduke looked hard at his assistant and told him to find out about Rachel Agnes. Dante thought for a moment as he heard that the young lady was the one who suffered. He wondered if his master had a grudge against the young lady. Dante sighed as he realized that it looked like one of the duchies would soon disappear from the face of the earth. He looked closely at his master and said that he would immediately take care of this issue. Theo, in turn, sighed heavily and thought about the young lady. He was sure that when he touched her, the curse had responded. A curse that consumed his family, that crippled him from the inside and made him thirst for blood. He was surprised because when he touched the young lady, it seemed to him that what the curse required had finally appeared. The Archduke looked at his son closely and told him to look at him carefully. He was enveloped in his own power and curse. Smiling, he told his son that he would soon follow in his father's footsteps. He said that it would definitely be like that, because the curse of their family was immortal. He shouted to his son that this was his future. The boy was scared. The Duke shouted to his son that death was already waiting for him. He said that there was no point in running away from fate. Sighing heavily, he told his son that he too would disappear into the flames of no curse. Theo knew perfectly well that he needed to check everything as quickly as possible. He knew he needed to meet the young lady as soon as possible. He wondered if she was really the one who would free him from the shackles of evil fate. With the speed of lightning, the young lady left the carriage. She sighed heavily, as she was very tired. Ellis Wither, the head maid, looked at her mistress and greeted her. She said that she would certainly report to her now about everything that happened. Estate in her absence. Ellis said they organized a reliable food supply route, conducted numerous interviews to select staff, and placed them throughout the estate. She looked intently at the lady and said that the butler would tell her separately about the contents of the mansion. The Duchess looked at the head maid and asked where her sister was. The maid hesitated and said that there was some problem, and it concerned the new maid that the Duchess had brought to the estate. The head maid sighed heavily and said that the maid was being bullied by the other maids. Looking at the Duchess, she asked what she would do about it. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that they would first observe. The head maid was surprised she had not expected such a thing at all. The Duchess sighed heavily and, looking at the maid, said that more than one obstacle would await her sister ahead. She said that many maids could do their jobs perfectly, but from Bella she expected more than just a job well done. The Duchess, in turn, understood perfectly well that her sister's future would depend on her height. She understood perfectly well that no matter how hard she tried to protect her sister from trouble, there would come a time when she simply would not have time to do it. For this reason, Bella should become her sister's confidant for such cases. The Duchess looked closely at her sister. She knew that she was doing everything only for her good. She did everything for her comfort. The Duchess looked at her sister with a smile and asked for forgiveness for waking her up at such a late hour. Rachel wanted only happiness and peace for her sister. Liz smiled and asked her sister to sleep with her. The Duchess did not refuse her. She wanted her carefree days to last forever. The Marquise was taken aback and looked at her ledges in surprise. She was very frightened. The Marchioness looked at her husband and said that they had received news from their father. He told her that they had been putting up with the antics of the Agnes family for a long time. She looked at her husband and said with a grin that it was time to put them in their place, considering that a convenient opportunity had arisen. She looked at her husband and said with a smirk that she would make sure that that nasty girl couldn't sleep from fear. She was ready to do anything to avenge her husband, who suffered at the hands of the Archduke. Marcus looked at the Duchess intently and said that for some reason Greywood had refused to meet. The Duchess was in shock. Her mood had already been bad since the morning. She knew that she needed to think about something pleasant. She remembered how her sister looked when she woke up. She thought it was very cute. She remembered how her sister was so sweetly happy about the toy she was given. Thinking of her sister, she laughed. Marcus looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand her reaction. She sighed heavily and told him that they needed to try to find another organization of traders, even if it was small. She said that it was very important for the restoration of their territory. Many merchants left the territory, causing most people to lose their jobs. There was a shortage of goods due to supply problems, so the prices for them skyrocketed. She intended to solve this problem by inviting merchants to their territory to discuss the terms in advance. She knew that the largest guild that she had high hopes for had suddenly decided to cancel the meeting. The reason for this was their mistrust of her family. She looked closely at her assistant and told him to find out why they suddenly changed their minds. Marcus sighed heavily and said that they would do everything immediately. He looked at her closely and, breathing heavily, said that it would be very bad if they started having problems at the early stages. She smiled and said that there must always be a way out, and if Plan A didn't work, then they would move on to Plan B. She knew that if she were a tyrant like the Archduke, she wouldn't be doing this now. Everyone would bow their heads before her sister anyway. A moment later, she looked away as she noticed a letter. She knew that there were 4 duchies in the empire. The Duchess knew which signs suited them: Leo, Agnes Deer, Nose Snake, Harrisman Falcon, Lexville. She knew that the most important thing was that the Nose Duchy had the best smelting technology. In their family, there are twins born with one soul, split in two due to the hatred of God. In this world, they said it exactly like that. Such children were born to Duke Nose. To protect their family, did not declare itself for 7 whole years. This invitation to the banquet was sent to them to tell the world that they had awakened from their sleep. She knows that she is not a tyrant like the Archduke, but she understood that she must do everything in her power. She understood perfectly well that she needed to attend this event as soon as possible and stop the tragedy that could happen. She knew that when the twins came out into the world, their family would lose one of them. Dante looked at his master intently and said that he had already gathered reliable information about the Duchy of Agnes. He looked at the gentleman and said that although the current situation had improved, some problems still remained, and their weak point was trade. They had negotiated with the guild, but the attempt was unsuccessful. He sighed heavily and said that this was all that was known for today. Dante said that the Duchess has little choice now. He looked at the gentleman intently and said that if his predictions were correct, the last person she would turn to for help would be the Archduke. He smiled and told the gentleman that he could take advantage of this chance and deal with her, as it would not be difficult. The Archduke looked at his assistant in surprise. Theo Iscosa looked askance at his assistant and asked what he was talking about. He didn't understand who was supposed to deal with whom. Dante looked at his master with a radiant smile and said that, of course, he must deal with the Duchess. The Duke looked at his young assistant with bewilderment, and a moment later told him not to try to think and make decisions for him. Dante looked at the gentleman in surprise, as he did not understand what all these questions about the Duchess were for. He wondered if the gentleman really planned to destroy this duchy. The maid looked at Bella with fury and pushed her, shouting that it was because of Bella that the senior maid shouted at her. Bella looked at the maid in surprise and asked what she had to do with it. The maid shouted to Belly that she had been told to wash everything. Bella looked at her in surprise and said that it was not her job. She gave it to her, said what she thought, and thus did her a favor by putting the things in the laundry room. The maid was furious. She pounced on Bella with lightning speed and shouted that it seemed that she started to turn up her nose just because the Duchess brought her. She shouted at Bella that if she wanted a normal life, she should know her place. Bella thought for a moment and wondered why the Duchess had brought her to the estate. She knew perfectly well that she didn't really know anything and didn't know if she could handle it. She remembered the Duchess telling her that there were many people around who did their jobs well. The Duchess, with a gentle smile, told Belly that it was not at all easy to find people as kind and brave as she. She remembered how the Duchess had said that she had a little sister and she was very important to her, and for this reason she would leave all the care of her sister to Bella. In turn, Bella looked at the maid with fury and pushed her away from her with lightning speed. The maid was furious. She came closer to Bella and raised her hand to her. Bella understood perfectly well that if she showed weakness, the Duchess would lose trust in her. She knew perfectly well that she couldn't be allowed to mock the young miss any longer. She knew that she couldn't just let it go that easily. She knew that she had to stand up to whatever was destined for her. The young lady, in turn, slowly entered the room and asked in surprise what they were doing there. She looked at them intently as she saw everything that was happening. Bella was taken aback and tremblingly called out to the young lady. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, but did not answer. Bella was furious and did not understand how she was behaving in front of the lady. The young lady smiled and told her maid that everything was fine. Bella looked at the lady in surprise. A moment later, Bella came closer to the young lady and called her. Liz looked intently at her maid. Bella, in turn, could not stand it and burst into tears in front of the young mistress. The young lady looked at her maid and asked if she wanted the summer for the maid to disappear. Bella froze for a moment in surprise and, looking at her mistress, asked what she was talking about. Liz looked at her maid with tears in her eyes and said that that maid was always bothering her, and that was the reason she was very bad. Bella smiled and said that she was just really angry. She said that if you look at her from her side, then she probably really is an eyesore. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise. Bella smiled and said that she was clearly in her way. Bella sighed heavily and said that the maid had studied, built a career, passed interviews, and then got into the duchy, and she was here thanks to the Duchess. She sighed heavily and said that it was still wrong to take out her anger on her. She understood perfectly well that it was important for her to learn something too, and she did not at all want others to doubt the Duchess's love for her sister because of her. The young lady muttered something quietly, but angrily. Bella looked at her mistress in surprise and asked what she had just said. The young lady looked at her maid intently, but said nothing. and Bella froze in surprise for a moment. Liz looked at Bella and asked if it hurt. She smiled and asked Bella if she wanted her to blow on the wound. Bella looked at the lady with a surprised smile and asked if she would really do it. The young lady smiled and said that she would do it. She thought for a moment because she really wanted that maid to disappear as soon as possible. She knew that her sister was very wrong because she was not such a kind child as she seemed at first glance. She had a very dark and cold soul. She was always told that she was a strange and unpleasant child. She knew that her sister was shining like a star. She gave her her love, but still, Liz was puzzled and did not understand why all this happened to her. She knew that her sister was the most beautiful in the world, and now there was a scratch on the first toy that her sister gave her. The young lady was furious, and this was beginning to anger and upset her. Madame looked happily at the Duchess and thanked her with a smile for coming to her studio. Madame said the Duchess, she thought that she had already forgotten about her studio and had already managed to get upset. Rachel looked at Madame and said with a smile that there was no more talented designer in these parts than her. The Duchess smiled and said that she simply could not forget about it. Madame sighed heavily and said with a smile to the Duchess that she had not visited her for a long time, so she thought that perhaps she had offended her in some way. Madame bowed low and thanked the Duchess for having pleased her with her presence. The Duchess looked at Madame intently, but said nothing. She understood that the power of wealth and authority was simply astounding. Madame looked at the Duchess with a radiant smile and served her tea. She said that she had prepared it especially for her because the tea petals were of the highest class. She smiled and told the Duchess that this time she had visited her studio with a wonderful girl. The madam smiled and asked what the young lady's name was. The Duchess said with a smile that she had some things to pick out, but first they were looking for some outfits, and for her sister, she was a success. She said that her sister was really nice to her, too dear. Madam looked at the young lady intently and said she was very good. The Duchess smiled and said, "Madam," to stop a little as the young lady was getting embarrassed. The madam looked at the young ladies with a smile and said that she thought the young lady would like the very dress that they had brought just recently. The Duchess looked at Madame in bewilderment, not understanding what was being discussed. The lady smiled and said that she had specially prepared it to show them, but for safety reasons, it could not be taken out yet. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that in that case they could come to the workshop. She looked at Madame and asked her to attach a man to her sister so that she could quietly look around while they were gone. Madame smiled and said that she would of course do everything quickly. The Duchess looked at her sister intently and with tears in her eyes said that she would be back soon. The young lady looked at Liz menacingly and asked if she was Auntie Ance's little girl. She said everyone said she was either killed or kidnapped. She looked at Liz with a grin and said that she looked great. Liz in turn looked intently at the girl but did not answer. The lady shouted angrily at the young girl that it was she who had stolen the potatoes from their house. Liz looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. The lady grabbed her by the hair in rage and began to scream and beat her. At the same time, she saw a girl who was looking at her with a grin and holding a bag of potatoes in her hands. Liz looked at the girl intently, but said nothing. The girl smiled and looked at the young lady and asked if she really had a guardian. Liz looked at the girl with cold fury and told her to leave her alone while she spoke nicely. The girl looked at her with a grin and said that she was not scared at all. She looked closely at Liz and with a grin said that since they met again, she could do a good deed. She said that Liz could buy more clothes from her. After all, they had a good relationship in the past. She knew that she couldn't ask such a thing of a girl who wasn't even considered a person. After all, it hurt her pride. But if she didn't fulfill the monthly quota, then she would be fired. And this way, she could keep her job. On this street, they cling to the status of even the person passing by. If someone is dressed in cheap and simple clothes, then he is escorted away from this place. The most influential here is the Eliard Studio. The young lady went out of her way to get this vacancy. She managed to get to this street with great difficulty. She understood perfectly well that she had to become rich and walk with her head held high. The young lady sighed heavily. She had no desire to meet anyone who had anything to do with her past. She was puzzled because she felt like she was in a sweet dream. But unfortunately, she was forcibly returned to the cold and cruel reality. She understood perfectly well that she needed to think about good things. She thought about her beautiful and beloved sister. The girl looked at her with fury and asked if she heard what her elder sister was telling her. Liz looked at the girl with a smirk, and a moment later threw a cup of tea at her. The girl screamed as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at Liz with fury and shouted, "You're just a crazy bitch." She was furious and asked the young lady if she knew how much it all cost. Liz looked at the girl intently and said with a smirk that she only had one older sister. The girl looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Liz looked at her intently and said that her sister loved her very much. Liz looked at the girl with a smirk and said that she seemed to have warned her. She slowly raised the glass above her head. Liz looked at the girl with fury and said that it would be better if she didn't touch her. A moment later, she poured the contents of the glass over her head. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood very well that the wounds received in the past did not heal as easily as she had previously thought. This became clear to her when she saw the expression on her sister's face. The Duchess was furious. She did not understand why people could not treat her carefully without causing her pain. She wondered if it was all for the plot. She was furious and wondered if they had to create a villain. She looked at everyone present with fury, as she could not allow this to happen. The girl froze in shock for a moment. She didn't know what to do or how to get out of this situation. Liz sighed heavily and looked at the girl with tears in her eyes. She said that the girl told her that she had no right to be in a place like that. She sighed heavily and, bursting into tears, said that unfortunately this was not her level and she did not correspond to them at all. The Duchess rushed to her sister. She hugged her tightly. Liz, bursting into tears, said that she herself did not know her place. The Duchess was furious. She knew perfectly well that her sister was constantly being offended by people, and she was disappointed in them every time. Rachel knew perfectly well that whatever she said now would not help heal her emotional wounds. The Duchess hugged her sister tightly and told her to remember just one rule. She angrily told her sister not to let anyone bully her. The Duchess told her sister that she was the dearest person to her, and she must not forget it. Some time later, the Duchess visited the Knowes estate. Noel and Jael greeted the Duchess. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and thanked her for coming to visit his grandchildren. Looking at his grandchildren, he said with a smile that they appeared at the end of his life, and for him they were simply treasures. She knew that the recent events had made her even more convinced that she needed power. She knew perfectly well that she had to make sure that no one would dare harm her sister again, and she had to make sure that her sister no longer had to cope with everything alone. She understood perfectly well that she needed to completely protect her sister from problems. She knew that in any world, power is the strongest weapon the Duchess had to make her family stronger than before. She knew that the first thing she needed to do was make good connections. Duke Knowes, one of the 4 high-ranking aristocrats. She sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that she needed to gain his trust for this. She knew that she had to save one of the twins who was going to get hurt today. She understood perfectly well that helping people was a very important matter, but there was one small snag. She knew that Duke Noel Knowes, the second male character in the original story, was a saintly figure. She knew that the main character asked him for help in order to destroy the Agnes family. She knew that the young man had closed himself off from the world and blamed himself for his brother's death. The main character told him that it was not his fault at all, because God had simply called his brother to himself much earlier. She told him with a smile that he should not reproach himself at all. Her small hands and beautiful speech saved the impressive child from eternal wandering in endless darkness. Everyone loved the saint very much. No one ever tried to harm her. because one word from her could melt the eternal ice in the heart of the main character. The young lady remembered that her sister had said earlier that if a person puts on airs, then he is not so eager to achieve what he wants. Once upon a time, she drank poisoned wine, and her body began to freeze. Now she really wanted to show her sister the love she dreamed of knowing. She wanted to prove that her feelings were not as reckless as they might seem at first glance. The twins looked in surprise at the gift prepared by the Duchess. The Duke looked at the Duchess in surprise, as she had prepared a gift for his grandchildren. He thanked her for it with a gentle smile. The young man opened the gift and froze for a moment. He thanked the Duchess in bewilderment. The Duke looked at the gift with surprise. But a moment later he told his grandchildren that the whistle could help them if they were in a dangerous situation. He smiled and said that it was a very useful thing. The Duchess smiled tenderly, and looking at them, said that it was completely unknown where the children might run away and what might happen to them. The Duchess smiled and said that watching her sister, she thought it would be a good idea to have such a small object with her. The Duke looked at the young Duchess in surprise, as he did not know that she had a sister. She smiled and said that she had recently brought her home. The Duchess said with her smile that her sister was very sweet and kind, and also that she was 8 years old. The Duke sighed heavily, and looking at his grandchildren, said that it seemed the Duchess had had a hard time. He looked at her in surprise, and asked why she didn't bring her sister to visit them. He said that she was almost the same age as his grandchildren, and they could become good friends. The young lady looked at him intently. She understood that he was an ordinary grandfather who loved his grandchildren very much. She smiled and said that her sister had an etiquette lesson. She looked at the Duke intently and said that if he didn't mind, she would bring her. Next time, he smiled and said that he was looking forward to it. The Duke said that etiquette could of course be learned over time, so there shouldn't be any problem with that. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that after she moved into her body, the Duchess, she completely changed the original plot. She mentally asked the saint for forgiveness because she understood that she had to save the little children. She understood perfectly well that this would be done partly for the good of her sister. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she simply could not watch the suffering and pain of children at such an early age. The twins were talking to each other, but suddenly the man accidentally hit one of the twins. The man cursed and said that because of the young man, he had soiled his waistcoat. The young man lived with the spear and asked for forgiveness. Mason Wilbur, the Marquise's second son, looked at the young people with a grin and asked if they were really the twins. Mason said with a grin that it was not right for a boy to drag a doll around with him. He said with a sneer that twins had their quirks. After all, the boys froze in shock. The Duchess turned around because she heard a noise. The twins heard the adults talking. Noel was very upset. He didn't want any kind of celebration to be held on the occasion of their birthday from the very beginning. Noel knew perfectly well that none of them came to congratulate them from the bottom of their hearts. He rushed out into the street with lightning speed. He was upset because they were celebrating a birthday which even their parents did not congratulate them on. Noel wasn't even surprised that others came to them not for them. Noel looked closely at his mother. He noticed that she was not in the mood. He quietly asked if she would like him to bring her dinner. Noel called his mother, but she did not answer him, and sat in one place like a wax doll. He wanted her to look at him. The lady quietly asked her son to leave. He ran away from her with tears in his eyes. She sighed heavily as this irritated her. Noel ran with tears in his eyes. He was very upset because he wanted some love and warmth, but unfortunately, no one could give it to him. The lady gave him the teddy bear with disdain, but first she poked the toy with sharp pins. She casually told him to take the toy and play somewhere far away from her. The boy angrily threw his toy into the lake. He was furious and shouted that he didn't need all this. Noel screamed at his brother that he was also not respected. He was furious and did not understand why they had to grow up in such an environment. The young man quietly approached his brother. He looked at him with a gentle smile and said that he didn't need to whine in front of his older brother. But the young man continued to cry in turn without stopping. Jael smiled a tender smile and said that he was still born before his brother and he is older. He looked at his brother with a beaming smile and told him to wait a minute as he would save his doll. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that apparently his grandchildren had been rude to him, and the Duke had asked for forgiveness on their behalf. He looked at the young man closely and said that they were still children, and there was nothing wrong with that. The young man said with a smile that it would be good if they did not carry this toy everywhere, as it looked very strange. After all, a boy should not do that. The Duchess looked at the young man with fury and asked if only girls played with dolls. She angrily told the young man that it was not at all proper to teach others how to raise children, especially when it was done by a stranger. The young lady turned around and said that she wanted to go to the boys. She told the Duke that he could take care of the guests for now. The Duke smiled and thanked the Duchess, and he also said that she should come to them later. The young man looked intently after the Duchess. He knew that if it were not for her irritability and hot temper, she would be suitable for the role of wife. The Duchess left the banquet hall in a hurry. She was very irritated. The Duchess walked slowly towards the young men. She remembered that the young man's name was Mason. She was furious because she remembered the disgusting look he had given her. She sighed heavily because she understood perfectly well that this was not the most important thing. Now she understood perfectly well that she should not waste her precious time at all. The Duchess looked into the distance. She knew she had to concentrate immediately. She knew that the very thing was about to happen, and she had to prevent the tragedy that could happen to the twins. She knew she had to listen to the sounds. The Duchess stood in line for a moment, became nervous. She did not know where they were and wanted them to call her as soon as possible. A moment later, Noel blew his whistle. Noel made a sound, wanting to feel the touch of the saint. At the same time, his brother dived into the water to get his toy. The Duchess, in turn, rushed into the lake with lightning speed. The young man froze in shock and surprise at the mass. Duchess Haste swam up to the boy. She picked him up. The young man was puzzled. He understood that he had to die. With the speed of lightning, she grabbed him in her arms and quickly emerged from under the water. The young people were puzzled and surprised. This situation turned out to be very scary for them. The Duchess looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that he was a good boy. Noel froze for a moment in shock. She looked at him intently and said with a gentle smile that he had not forgotten about her gift after all and had used it for its intended purpose. She looked at them intently and said with a smile that everything would be fine now. The Duchess, in turn, was very glad that this story ended happily. Although initially, she only wanted to gain the trust of the Duke himself, now she was more pleased with the fact that the children remained safe. She looked closely at the twins because she knew that the most important thing was that they were happy. A moment later, she heard a noise in the distance. She wondered if the Duke had already arrived. But a moment later, she froze in place, in shock and surprise. The Archduke looked at them closely and said that someone had already managed to take a bath. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock. She did not expect to see him. Noel looked at his uncle in surprise and greeted him. The Duchess was shocked as she heard that the boy called the Archduke uncle. She froze in surprise and wondered if she was the only one who was embarrassed by this situation. The twins ran up to the Archduke and asked him to hug them. Jael looked at his uncle and said with a smile that he was cold, and also asked if he could light a fire. The Archduke said that he could not do that, but he also said that they could not be left outside, otherwise they could get sick. He said that they needed to go inside quickly. The Duchess, in her turn, slowly wanted to leave. The Archduke said that she should also go inside. The Duchess froze for a moment in surprise. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was not coming. The Duchess, with tears in her eyes, said that she was coming now. She was puzzled since she did not want to get involved with him at all. JL looked at his uncle, with tears in his eyes, and asked if he really had to wash himself, since he had already bathed in the pond. The Archduke looked at the boy closely and said that his grandfather already knew everything, and if he wanted to appear before him in such a form, he could not wash himself. The boy froze in surprise and shock. The Duchess, in turn, let out a silent cry from the heart. The Archduke froze in surprise. He saw the girl running. He was surprised and did not understand who she was, so desperately trying to catch up with. He looked after her in surprise as he saw the silver light which was dissipating in the night that had swallowed everything around. He suddenly heard a sound that caught his attention. Now he was sure that that girl was just a butterfly. He understood perfectly well that if he took it in his hands, it would break into small pieces. The Duchess, in turn, sat quietly in the room. She was puzzled and wanted to go home as soon as possible. The Archduke, in turn, looked intently at the young Duchess. At the same time, the twins were washing themselves. The young lady wanted them to come back as soon as possible, as she missed them very much. She was puzzled and did not understand why the young man did not take his gaze off her. She looked at him intently and timidly said that she very much hoped that he was not now thinking of burning her, along with the Marquise's hand. The Archduke looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She froze for a moment as she was very scared by his intense gaze. He looked at her closely and said that it seemed like she knew that one of the twins had fallen into the pond. She was taken aback and timidly asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that if she was uncomfortable answering that question, he wouldn't make her do it because that wasn't what he wanted to know. The Duchess froze in shock. The Archduke stood up and slowly walked closer to her. He looked at her intently and said that she should give him her hand. The young lady froze in surprise. She did not understand what he wanted from her. He looked at her calmly and said that she should give him her hand. The Duchess was surprised and did not understand why he needed her hand. He looked at the Duchess intently, as he was a little irritated. The Archduke said that she would be, and she herself understood that he was not going to harm her. The young lady looked at him timidly and asked why he was asking her about it then. He sighed heavily and said that he needed to know something. The young lady slowly extended her hand to him, and with tears in her eyes, asked if he would burn it. The Archduke, in turn, was very irritated. He looked at her with cold fury and said that he should have spoken to her differently from the beginning. He looked at her with cold fury and said that she must give him her hand if she did not want to die. The Duchess was in shock. She understood perfectly well that if he needed her hand, then she had to quickly lend him her hand. She was in shock and did not want to die suddenly from not fulfilling his order. She was shocked because she understood that he said very scary things and did not even blink an eye. She sighed heavily because it seemed that the rumors about him were true. She looked at the Archduke in fascination. It seemed to her that cold blood flowed through him, but his hand was warmer than she expected. She wondered if this was the influence of magic. She sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that she needed to think positively, because she rarely had the chance to observe such a beautiful man up close. With tears in her eyes, she enjoyed his face. A moment later, the Archduke's face changed, and with a radiant smile looking at the Duchess, he said that he had found something. The Duchess, in turn, looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady was in shock and did not understand what was happening at all. But a moment later, the Archduke pulled her towards him with lightning speed. She froze in surprise. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that they would see each other again soon. She froze in shock and did not understand what nonsense he was talking about now. She looked at him intently and said that she did not understand at all what he was talking about. A moment later, the Duke burst into the room. He was furious, he screamed, and called for his grandchildren. But a moment later, he turned his gaze to the Archduke and Duchess. He froze in shock and looked at them in surprise, asking what was going on. The Duchess, in turn, looked at the Duke in confusion. The Duke was in shock. He shouted to the Archduke that it was forbidden to kill in his house. The young lady sighed heavily, as she wanted someone to save her as soon as possible. Noel and Jael looked at the Duchess and asked if her sister was as beautiful as she was. They said that they were twins, and they could be friends with her sister. The Duke, in turn, thanked the Duchess with a radiant smile. He said that he simply did not know how to repay her for this. He said that if she needed help, she could easily turn to him, and he would help her in any circumstances. Some time later, the Duchess was returning home. She sighed heavily, as she knew she had done well, but she was a little confused and tired for an inexperienced Duchess. It was impossible, but she was able to gain their favor and tied them with strong bonds. She knew that the Duke's promises were worth more than all the gold in the world. And the Duchess, in turn, understood perfectly well that this would greatly help her in protecting her sister as well as the entire family. Although it seemed to her that she had taken something even more sinister from there. She thought for a moment, because she didn't understand why he smiled at her predatorily then. For a moment she froze in fear, because no matter how much she thought, she still felt uneasy. The tyrant in the fantasy world made her very wary. The Duchess was puzzled and did not understand why he needed her hand. She wondered if she was some kind of sedative for him. She sighed heavily, as she knew that he just read too many novels. She knew that he was very difficult to meet, and she just needed to stay away. The Archduke looked closely at his assistant and said that last time he had told him in time about how to deal with the Duchess. He looked closely at the assistant and said that he would like to hear more about everything. Daniel looked at the gentleman in surprise. Greywood is a very large and powerful merchant guild that is located in the south of the Duchy of Agnes. Daniel sighed heavily and said that judging by the fact that she refused the Duchess and continues to conduct foreign trade, Count Wickens, the head of this guild, is going to spoil his relationship with the Duchess. Theo looked at his assistant closely and said that this was a big group, so they decided to go out confidently. But even if it was the dawn of the county, he wondered if they were underestimating the Duchess too much. Theo said that their opponents were one of the respected families of the empire. Daniel sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, at the moment it was too weak. He understood perfectly well that no matter what the Duchess did, if Greywood interfered, there would be problems. Daniel said that since she had only recently taken over her domain, she would have many difficulties. He looked at his master intently and said that the last option for her would be only one place. He understood perfectly well that there was one place where the Merchant Guild was limited in its influence. He looked intently at the Archduke and said that this was indeed his duchy. Theo, for his part, wondered if he would just have to sit and wait. He sighed heavily, knowing that he just needed to be patient for a little while. He was very pleased and happy because he knew that he would simply wait until she came to him herself. The Count was furious. He understood that his son-in-law was left without an arm, and now he was forced to live a miserable life. The young man looked closely at the gentleman and said that everything was going according to his plan. He told the Count that he should not be too angry at all, as it could have a bad effect on his health. The Count was furious, as he knew that the Duchess had raised taxes 6 months ago, after which he had to suffer heavy losses. Now she had made a laughingstock of her daughter's husband. He was furious because he wanted to tear the Duchess to pieces. He wanted her to incarnate also for the sins of the Archduke. He was furious because he knew that she must kneel before him. The Duchess sighed heavily and wondered if anyone remembered her. Marcus looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that nothing like that had happened. And she also asked what he thought about what she had told him. He looked at her closely and asked if she really wanted to issue weapons from the Nose family to knights above the title of centurion. He looked at the Duchess intently and said that the Duke's family gave almost half of their weapons to the imperial family, and the rest they gave to the market. He looked at the lady intently and said that even if the weapons were given only to the centurions, it would be a huge amount, and the supply of material would be problematic. The young lady looked at her assistant intently and asked what would happen if they bought weapons at the market. Marcus was taken aback and looked at her in surprise, asking if she really wanted to make a deal directly with the Duke. He was shocked and did not understand how she wanted to do this. The young lady smiled and said that she was sure the Duke would be pleased to agree to her proposal while she slowly fed her sister dessert. The Duchess looked at her assistant with a smile and said that for that reason, he did not need to worry about it. She said that he only needed to find out how many weapons they needed. She said that she was just about to visit them again because she wanted her sister to have friends. She knew that in the original story, due to the loss of her brother, J-Pel Knox becomes her sister's most dangerous enemy. The Duchess, in turn, understood perfectly well that this time they should become her comrades. Liz looked at her sister and said with a smile that she was enough for her. The Duchess looked at her sister with a smile and said that as soon as she had friends, she would talk differently. Liz looked at her and said that she was speaking seriously now. The Duchess smiled and told her sister that those boys were very nice and handsome, and they would make wonderful companions for her. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and agreed with her sister. Rachel knew perfectly well that her sister was probably scared of meeting new people. She sighed heavily because she wanted to try her best to dispel her fears so that she could live wonderfully and not be afraid of anything. She wanted some beautiful colors to appear in her life. She hoped that her sister would show a little courage and not close herself off from the world. She really wanted her sister to spread her wings and fly. The Duchess looked at her assistant with cold fury and said that now she wanted to hear a report on the Merchant Guild. She knew perfectly well that she had to be her spear and shield until she grew up. Marcus looked at the young lady intently and said that he had been informed that the Merchant Guild controlled every trading point in the duchy. Since the guild was the largest, it had a tremendous influence on the others. He said that when some merchants wanted to sell something to the duchy, the union members would persuade them by naming an amount tens of times larger. They really wanted to sow chaos in the duchy. She looked at the assistant in surprise and asked why they were still refusing their offer. Marcus looked timidly at the lady and said that he would like to clarify one point. He asked if she had had a conflict with Count Wickens. She looked at her assistant in surprise and asked who this count was. Marcus sighed heavily and said that Agraf had not met her personally, but he was the master of the guild. Looking at the lady, he said that even if we were to accept the idea that they were harboring a grudge because of the sudden tax increase 6 months ago, such actions could only be regarded as a declaration of war. She sighed heavily as she understood that they were simply out of their minds. Marcus sighed heavily and said that she had done this. He finished his report on the trade guild. A moment later he said that the Count's son-in-law had recently lost his arm, and for this reason he had become very mad. The young lady, in turn, was shocked by this news. She did not expect to hear such a thing at all. She looked closely at her assistant and asked if the Count's son-in-law was really the Marquis. Marcus looked at her in surprise, but still said that it was exactly like that. There was an awkward silence between them for a moment. She was shocked and didn't understand why they were taking out all their anger on her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was all over for her. Marcus looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She was furious because the Count was the head of a large guild, and he held a grudge against an innocent man. Marcus looked at the Duchess intently and said that unfortunately there was only one way out. She sighed heavily and agreed with him. Some time later, the young lady met the Archduke. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he himself had said that they should see each other soon. She smiled and said that the hour had come. He looked at the young lady closely and said that she probably came to him because of the Merchant Guild. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that it turned out that he himself knew why she came to him. She knew very well that the Archduchy of Lexville was part of the Empire, but it had autonomy recognized by the imperial family. In other words, it was almost an independent state. Rachel looked at Theo intently and said that she needed a guild from his domain so she wanted to make a deal with him. Rachel knew that if the guild dared to lure away the Lexville merchants or put pressure on them with a simple conflict, the situation would not end. It would mean that they were ready to start a war with the Archduchy. Rachel knew full well that if there was a serious discord, the imperial family would not leave the guild alone. Theo looked closely at the Duchess and asked what he would get in return. The Duchess looked at him intently and said that she remembered that evening and his words about what he had found. The Duchess stood up slowly and said to Theo that it looked like what he was looking for was with her. Rachel looked at him with a radiant smile and said that she was ready to make a deal with him. Theo looked hard at the Duchess and asked if she was willing to give him this, no matter what he asked for. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was ready to do anything, as long as he did not demand that she give up her life. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it would not be so difficult. The Archduke said he wanted to check something on her body. She froze in shock for a moment. A moment later, the Archduke grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him. The Duchess involuntarily screamed. A moment later, she froze in place, in surprise, as she found herself in his arms. He looked at her intently and with a sly grin, said that they knew how many dirty thoughts had slipped through her head, but he was not interested in such things. The young lady, in turn, froze in place from shock and embarrassment. All her inner thoughts screamed that she did not believe him. But in reality, she looked at him with a smirk and said that his behavior did not match his words. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she really didn't feel anything. He smiled and said that his conditions were simple. The Archduke said that whenever he wanted, he would hold her hand. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he intended to do such a thing. He said that there was no reason for this. He said that his help was coming to her almost for nothing, considering that she had to save her people who were in danger of dying from hunger. The Duchess thought that she would have to make an unprofitable and expensive deal, but fortunately, she was able to save her precious money. She knew that here one could only rejoice. The Duchess smiled and agreed to his demands. She knew that from now on, her hand belonged entirely to him. The maids were in shock after the young lady left. They were surprised and could not think that this estate someone would ever visit, and especially a young lady. No one will ever know how carefully they cleaned the guest room. The maids really wanted the young lady to have a good impression of the place. The Count was furious. He did not understand why this duke suddenly decided to make an agreement with the Duchess. The young man was shocked. He shouted to the Count that they had no other options. After all, the Archduke's guild would take all the places of their merchants. The Count in turn was furious. He knew that his daughter was impatiently awaiting the Duchess's downfall. He was furious because she had broken the unwritten rule of not touching the Archduke. The Count was shocked, and in his anger he knew that there had to be a way that would help him destroy the Duchess. The young man looked at his master intently and said that it was unlikely, or that it had something to do with the Archduke's gender, and that perhaps the Archduke wanted to increase the size of his market, and for that reason, he had decided to enter into an agreement with the Duchess. The young man looked at the Count intently and said that the Archduke had rejected the daughter of Harrisman himself. The Count was silent for a moment. A moment later, he remembered that the young lady herself had said that she was unrequitedly in love with the Archduke. A moment later, the Count laughed hysterically. He knew that he just had to push the dukes to tear each other's throats out. He looked closely at his assistant and said with a satisfied grin that he needed to send a letter to the Duke urgently. Some time later, the young lady returned to her estate. Everyone was very happy because they understood that soon their duchy would return to its former glory. They were glad that their mistress tried. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at everyone present. She was a little excited. She looked at everyone present and asked if it was possible that the Archduke had fallen in love with her, and for a moment, everyone froze in shock. Marcus looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The knight captains, in turn, shouted that they needed to call a doctor immediately. The young man, the son, looked mockingly at the young lady. He said that she was the only heir of the family, and also a girl. They looked at the Marquis in surprise and told him to choose an expression. The Marquis smiled and said that they should not think anything unnecessary, since he only expressed his concern. The young lady in turn froze in place from tension and shock. He said with a grin that if this girl was the heiress, then the line of succession of the great house could not be clearly established. Instead of sending her to Marquez and Rupert, she was examined during the night, and because of her maid's concern, she decided to simply sort her mail and go to bed. However, the Duchess knew that the Marquis, the former Duke, and his wife did not like her very much. She knew that the Marquis challenged the Duke's self-control, and all his comments were extremely rude. He said that she was not strong enough to compete with the other duchesses. The young lady in turn wondered why he had sent her an invitation to the celebration if they did not get along very well. She knew that her maid's voice was too loud, and she could not ignore her desire to help. The Duchess sighed heavily. She had no idea what they would say if she ignored the invitation given to her. Marcus looked at the Duchess intently and asked if she would go to the event. She sighed heavily and said that she thought she should. The Duchess wondered how long it had been since her return. She knew her sister would be very upset. She understood perfectly well that she was an adult who had a job, so she hoped her sister would understand her and would certainly wait for her. She knew that her sister was younger, kind, and sweet. The Duchess wondered if her sister had received the same invitation as she had. The Duchess, in turn, wondered how much poison her sister had drunk to become such an unstoppable villain. She knew she was looked down upon as a child. Rachel wondered what about Liz. At 9 years old, she was supposed to be a duchess. She wondered how often she had been underestimated. When she got tired of the manhua world, where there was war every day, she would have these thoughts, and every time this happened, she began to love her sister more and more. The Duchess was a little worried that she needed to spend time with her sister in order to get closer to those people. She looked into the distance with a smile, as the thought of their future together helped her to fight on. A moment later, the Duchess called her assistant. She looked at her assistant with a radiant smile and said that they needed to hold on. He looked at her in surprise because he didn't understand what she was talking about. Some time later, the Archduke looked intently at this invitation. At the same time, Dante was reporting to his master. He looked intently at the gentleman because he understood that he was not even listening to him. Dante sighed heavily and, looking at the Archduke, said that he had much to report to him. He looked intently at the gentleman and said that it was time to leave. But the imperial family was still silent. He was puzzled and did not know what to do now. Theo sighed heavily and said that they could forget about it for a while. The young man was surprised by the Archduke's answer. He began to be indignant. Theo sighed heavily and told his assistant not to worry, as he had a backup plan. He looked at his master intently and with surprise, since he did not understand at all what he had been thinking about lately. He thought that he would wipe the Agnes family off the face of the earth, but this turned out not to be the case, and everything happened just the opposite. He helped the Duchess without taking a penny. Dante sighed heavily, as he knew that the master never behaved in such a way. Dante was surprised because he understood that his master would gain nothing from these negotiations. And apparently it seemed to him that the master was extremely interested in the Duchess. But looking at the master, it was extremely difficult for him to believe it now. For the first time in his long service, he could not guess his intentions. He didn't understand what kind of alternative plan his master had. He understood perfectly well that the Archduke's magical powers had to be regularly fed with blood. It had to be non-animal, and a small amount was not enough for him. Dante understood perfectly well that the Archduke's magic required a human sacrifice, and if he did not get what he wanted in time, it would be very bad. When Dante saw young Theo like this as a child, he was shocked and couldn't believe what was happening. The Archduke sighed and said that it would appear that the emperor was brazenly trying to play his own game. Every legitimate emperor knew about the curse of the Archduke's line. Previous dukes, like Theo, regulated their affairs with the emperors, but the current emperor killed the previous one and imprisoned the heir in a forgotten place. It was decided that the secret of the Lexville family would remain a secret. The emperor must have guessed that the Archduke's obsession with war was not just his whim. Dante sighed heavily and said that it seemed that the emperor was choosing a very stupid path. He asked the Archduke if he wanted to get rid of the emperor. He sighed heavily and said that he would not do it now because it was still too young in the imperial palace. He sighed heavily and said that there was something he wanted to know right now. He understood perfectly well that sooner or later the thirst for blood would get the better of him again. He understood perfectly well that it could be risky, but he still knew that the game was worth the candle. He remembered the lips of the young lady who wanted to tell him everything, but she was shaking with fear and therefore remained silent with a smile. He in turn wondered if she would run away from him this time. He said with a smile that he was very interested in what would come of it. Liz looked at her sister closely and asked with a smile if it was okay that she was so weird. She asked her sister if she would always be on her side. The Duchess looked at her sister intently and said that she would of course always be with her and on her side. The Duchess knew perfectly well that her sister knew nothing, but she knew a great deal about her. The Duchess wondered if her sister would look like her when she grew up. She thought that most likely the eyes would be a little different. She, in turn, really hoped that her sister would be able to take care of herself when she grew up, because her love for her was the most sincere and real. The Marquis looked at the Duchess with a grin on his face. The Marquis said with a grin that they had not seen each other for a long time. The Duchess was shocked as he spoke to her informally. He looked at her intently and with a sly smile thanked her for finding time to visit, despite her busy schedule. She looked at him intently and wondered if she was imagining things or if he was actually speaking strangely. She smiled and said that it was time for her to go out. She looked at him intently because she understood that if it weren't for her status, he would easily crush her with his authority. She wondered if it was hard for him to talk about her becoming a duchess. She knew very well that the emperor had made every second person, even those who barely knew how to do business with the dukes. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that even if a stranger looked at her, he would think that she was his wife. He looked at her intently and mockingly and said that she would fit perfectly into his collection, but she did not want to lose her status as a duchess. Rachel looked at him in surprise as he said funny things. She knew perfectly well that he was one of those men who believed that only a man could rule a duchy. She looked at him intently, as she had always wondered why they continued to call her Duchess. The young lady thought for a moment and wondered who she really was. She knew that in another reality she was an actress. The Duchess looked closely at the Marquis and with a smirk said that she had not seen him for a long time. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect this. He sighed heavily, as he did not understand the girl at all. He looked at her mockingly and said that she seemed to have a lot of problems in her duchy. He said with a grin that if she needed help, she could safely contact him. Looking at the Duchess, he said that he had many friends and connections. He said with a grin that from the height of his experience, he would be able to help her in some way. The young lady looked at him intently and thanked him for his interest. She smiled and said that she dared to remind him that she was not just any girl but a duchess. She asked with a grin if he could really help her. The knight looked closely at his master and said that it seemed that the young lady had taken poison and was no longer breathing. The young man, in turn, slowly approached the young lady. He sighed heavily and said that he had heard that tears were witches before the rain. He looked at her closely as he wondered if she now felt his longing. The young lady, in turn, slowly looked out the window as she noticed that it was raining there. She sighed heavily as she missed her sister very much. She was puzzled as she did not like being alone with her thoughts at all. When she went to get a snack, Bella didn't say anything to her, but she suspected that she had started to be bullied again, and it was she who was being bullied by a maid named Mary. Liz was a little worried and confused because her maid didn't tell her anything, and suddenly she started spending little time with her. She knew perfectly well that you had been treating Bella worse and worse at the estate lately, which was why her sweet and naive self was becoming harsher. She understood perfectly well that if things continued like this, their relationship would deteriorate even more. She sighed heavily as she understood Bella perfectly, because she herself had gone through something similar. A moment later, she saw the maids. From their conversation, she realized that her case was locked in the room. The maid looked at her friend and said that Bella was the Duchess's maid, and if anyone found out, they would be in trouble. Mary looked at her friend intently and said that the Duchess simply did not have time to think about some maids. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily. She knew it was pure truth. After all, her sister didn't have much time to think about simple maids. After all, she was always busy and always somewhere away from home. The young lady was well aware that she too had a little power. She sighed heavily because she understood perfectly well that everyone thought that she simply couldn't stand up for herself. But she knew that this was not true at all. She knew that her strength lay in the fact that she could hide her bad mood. The young lady understood perfectly well that this was a gift for her sister, and if anyone found out about her secret, she would be in trouble. Standing at the door, she shouted and called her maid. Bella was shocked. She asked her mistress for forgiveness and also asked if she could call someone for help because the door could not be opened without a key. Liz knew very well that if she just thought about it and pretended to be calm, she would get rid of what was bothering her. The young lady smiled and told her maid to be patient for a little while, and she would help her immediately. She knew perfectly well that if her sister was too busy to attend to the maids, it was up to her to make her pay attention to them. The Marquis looked at the young Duchess and said with fury that of course she was no longer just the Duke's daughter, but he did not know whether she was worthy of taking his place. The Duchess, in turn, looked at him intently with bewilderment on her face. She did not answer his words. Everyone watched their squabble intently. The Marquis asked furiously if she really wanted to earn his respect. He said that nothing remained of the former greatness of her family. He shouted that she expressed respect to him, but deep down she was disgusted by it. The Duchess looked at the Marquis and laughed. She looked at him and said that it was not for nothing that they said that the Marquis's power was great. She said with a grin that it was clear that he was more important than the Emperor himself. The Marquis looked at her in surprise and asked angrily what she was talking about. The Duchess looked at him intently and asked if he, doubting her worth, was challenging the decision of the Emperor himself. She looked at him intently and said with a grin that when the head of the family changes, it is his word that is decisive. The Marquis looked at the young lady intently and said angrily that it was very clever of her. He was furious and did not understand how she dared to mention His Majesty. In simple conversation, he shouted that he was simply going to give her advice. He looked at her intently and said that he knew what it was like to live under the same roof with an illegitimate child. The Duchess looked at him with cold fury as he had crossed the line. He said with a smirk that humiliating others did not paint a nobleman. She was furious and couldn't understand how he dared to drag her sister into their conversation. She looked at him intently and said with cold fury that he was not the kind of person to give advice to. She said that before he dared to insult her or her loved ones, he should look at himself. She looked at him intently and said that she heard his second son was always bringing home courtesans. The young lady was furious. She knew that she would not stand silently and tolerate his acceleration towards her and her sister. She understood perfectly well that people like him had to be answered. A moment later, the Marquis threw a handkerchief at her feet in anger. He looked at the Duchess intently and said that she seemed to have become even more insolent. He cried out in fury that he was declaring a proxy war on her. He looked at her intently and shouted that she would pay for her actions. She understood very well what a proxy war was. This method was often used in conflicts between noble families. There was also a regional war. This is a global event, but proxy is just a duel. She understood very well that a fair fight would determine the outcome of the battle. She sighed heavily and thought, because she knew that she had no chance of winning. She knew that the losing side automatically agrees to all the conditions of the opponent. She knew that he would certainly not demand her property or her life, but he could very well make her kneel. She understood that she needed Ryder, who could win this duel. She did not even know how good he had to be. The level of the Marquise's knights was known. He was glad because he knew the level of her defenders. He wondered with a smirk if she knew how much his knights actually made. He wondered if the young girl who had destroyed her estate could defeat him. He knew she was a small, impudent girl that no one took seriously. The young lady standing in line froze for a moment in surprise as someone placed a hand on her shoulder. The Archduke looked at the Marquis intently and said that he accepted his challenge. The Duchess froze in shock and surprise. The Marquis, in turn, was amazed by what he heard. The Duchess was puzzled. She looked at the Archduke in surprise and called him. The Marquis was in shock. He did not understand what the Archduke was doing here. Theo looked at everyone present and said that they could start right now. The Marquis was taken aback and, looking at his opponent, asked what he meant. Theo looked hard at the Marquis and said that he would repeat once again that his challenge had been accepted. The Marquis was shocked, and in a rage he shouted at the Archduke that he had summoned the Duchess and not him. The young lady, in turn, stood quietly next to the Archduke, with bewilderment on her face. The Archduke looked at the Marquis intently and said that he had heard that he had outstanding knights. He said that he very much wanted to see for himself. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what he was talking about and what he was doing. She wondered if he had something to share with the Marquis, but she was more concerned about why he had intervened in such a war. But she in turn would be very grateful if the experienced knight helped her. She looked closely at the young man, wondering what he was thinking about now. The Marquis sighed heavily and said angrily that he would contact them later. The young lady was in shock. She accepted that he had changed right before everyone's eyes. She understood perfectly well that now the Marquis only had to get his bearings. She wondered if he was really that scared. She saw that everyone around immediately ran away. The young lady was taken aback and looked intently at the young man. She looked at him intently because she was very scared. It seemed to her that it was getting somehow hot here. Theo looked at her intently and called out. He said that she should do it quickly. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later he felt even worse, screaming that she must give him her hand. The young lady, in turn, was very frightened. Frozen in shock on the spot, she asked tremblingly what was happening. He looked at her intently and asked if she remembered her promise. Theo looked at her intently and said that whenever in any situation she should help him. His darkness enveloped them intently. The young lady stood and stared at him. She couldn't even move. She slowly, as if enchanted, extended her hand to him. At that moment, she thought that such an expression did not suit the young man at all. She extended her hand to him and froze in place for a moment. She looked intently at the Archduke, as she understood that his appearance did not suit him. Suddenly, that day, which was more like a dream, came to her mind when he looked at his nephews with tenderness and care, and at the same time he smiled tenderly at them. She was in shock and wondered what kind of pain had driven him to this state. She wondered what had already caused such reckless courage. As she touched him, she felt a strong sense of rationality. She felt a warmth spread through her body. She wondered if it was caused by Theo's flame. She had heard that when mages awakened on an instinctive level, they understood how to use their powers, just as they felt the moment of awakening itself, freely. She felt this feeling now. The young lady sighed heavily. She realized that she really did have magical powers. A moment later, she fell to the ground with a crash into the arms of a young man. The knight ran up to his master with lightning speed. He froze in surprise. A moment later, the Archduke called his knight and laughed. He smiled a satisfied smile and said that soon the curse of his family would lift. He looked closely at the young lady, as he knew that she would be his salvation. The young lady received one letter after another. She understood that many were looking for her. She knew that in the empire there was no one more influential than her. She was glad because she understood that from today, the story of how they chased her and her beauty would begin. The young lady was interested in watching how they tried to amuse her. All the authors of the letters wanted to be friends with her or wanted her love. She remembered one man who was very interesting. She was a little puzzled because she saw that he did not even send a letter to her father, but sent it to her straight away. The maid entered the room and told the young lady that her morning tea was ready. The maid looked around the office in surprise as the letters were on the floor. She asked her mistress for forgiveness and said that she would close the window right away. The young lady smiled and told her maid that she was not worried about this and was in no hurry. The maid smiled and told her mistress that she was too kind to her. The young lady smiled and told her maid that she was a very nice lady. The maid, with tears in her eyes, wondered how such a kind mistress could live in such a terrible and cruel world. The young lady, in turn, sat and read the letters intently. The maid looked at Mrs. Hay in surprise and called her. She was worried that her mistress was reading letters from strange men again. She sighed heavily. She knew that her mistress was very beautiful and sweet. She slowly handed her the newspaper and said that she really hoped it would cheer her up. She looked at the lady intently and said that there was a mention of the Archduke in today's newspaper, and it seems he was at the Marquise's banquet. As she left, the maid, with a smile, wished the lady good reading and rest. The young lady, in turn, read the newspaper. She was shocked because they wrote that the relationship with the Duchess and the Archduke had noticeably improved. She tore the newspaper up in anger, even in front of the maids. She maintained her image. She did not know how she could remain as beautiful if the man she desired was carried away by another. She thought that he must have just gone crazy to decide to chase after such a narcissistic girl. She was furious because she realized that there had been too many coincidences lately. She understood perfectly well that she was a shining sun, and her competitor is simply the moon. She understood perfectly well that she could not lose to her and simply had to outshine her. The young lady was furious. She did not understand why he chose her. She didn't understand why the Duchess was bathing in his arms, and not she. She knew that he was strong and handsome, and also cruel. She understood that no one would make him happier than she. She knew that if his heart became hers, then she could say with certainty that there was not a single person left in the world who did not love her. She knew that love meant the attention of the Archduke, a privilege that only she would enjoy. The young lady knew perfectly well that if anyone tried to deprive her of this privilege, he would immediately go to hell. She knew that she herself did not need to get her hands dirty. Caroline knew perfectly well that the Duchess was just fresh meat that had recently come out into the world, and since she had touched the rose, she should be prepared to meet the thorns. Some time later, the Duchess woke up and sighed heavily. A moment later, she was taken aback and came to her senses completely. The Archduke sighed heavily and told the young lady not to twitch so much as she might get dizzy. She sighed heavily and asked, puzzled, how long she had slept. He looked closely at the young Duchess and said that she had slept for about a few hours. She was excited and had a very bad headache. She didn't understand where they were or where they were going. He looked at her intently and said that she was asking something that was already obvious. The young lady looked closely at her hands and told the Archduke that he must explain everything to her immediately because she did not quite understand what was happening. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't understand. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he meant. The Archduke sighed heavily and said that there were already rumors about his blood curse. He looked closely at the young Duchess and sighed heavily and said that it was true. For a while there was complete silence and an awkward atmosphere between them. She looked at him with a puzzled look because he scared her very much. She looked at him intently and asked if he had anything else he wanted to tell her. Theo looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted to know more. She sighed heavily, knowing that she had been a fool to sympathize with him a moment ago. She understood perfectly well that he was cursed, because it was clear right away. In addition to this, she clearly saw his pain out of fear. She unconsciously used magic. She wondered if it was really a surge of her energy. She wondered if it was because of her power that she had not died from the poison. It remembered that the doctor had told her that after such poisoning, only magicians or saints survive awakening special powers within themselves. She understood perfectly well that in all of history, there had only been one such magician. She realized that she might have been the second one, and she also understood perfectly well that there were still advantages to reincarnation. She looked intently at the Archduke as she realized that he simply needed her. She thought for a moment and wondered if she should change the price of the deal right away. The Archduke looked at the young lady with bewilderment, for he saw that she was up to something. She wondered if all her fear would go away if she looked at him every day. She wondered if magic wasn't something like physical strength. At the moment when he hugged her, it seemed to her that his energy seemed to be crying. She wondered if it seemed to her because she was feeling bad. A moment later, the knight looked at the young people with a smile and said that they had arrived. The young lady, in turn, slowly left the carriage and froze for a moment in surprise. She looked at the young men in surprise and asked if they really wanted to bring her to her home. She was taken aback because she did not know why they did this, and she was also confused because she did not see her knights. She looked at them puzzled and asked if they had killed them. Theo sighed heavily and said that they had not done so. Arthur looked at the Duchess with a smile and said that her knights were ready to kill the Archduke for her. For a moment the young lady was taken aback as her inner fear washed over her again. Arthur looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that everything was fine. She looked at him in surprise as she thought that everything was not fine. She sighed heavily as she knew that everything was fine, and she was actually proud of her knights. The Archduke and his knight said goodbye to the Duchess. The young lady, in turn, was in shock because they abandoned her. She was terrified, as her day had been very terrible and eventful. Unfortunately, she was very exhausted because of this story with magic. It seemed to her that she would simply collapse to the ground. She understood that next time she would have to give the order not to touch her people. The head maid bowed and greeted her mistress. She looked hard at the Duchess and said that the bath was ready and they would start preparing dinner for her at once. The Duchess looked at the maid and said that it was very good, and she also asked the head maid to tell her sister that they would dine together. The head maid looked at her mistress with a smile and said that Miss knew she was coming and was waiting for her. The Duchess smiled and said that she would take a quick bath and come down right away. Ellis looked at the lady intently and said that after the bath, she would bring her some hot tea. The Duchess thanked her. Anne looked at her mistress with a radiant smile and told her that it seemed that the miss was already meeting her. The Duchess, in turn, was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. With the speed of lightning, she turned around, as if she wanted to see where her sister was. But for a moment she froze in shock as she saw her sister falling down the stairs. She froze in place for a moment, but at the same second she screamed and called her sister. The young lady understood perfectly well that if a person chooses politeness and caution to achieve a goal, then he is either a weakling or a fool. The young lady slowly approached the maid, and with a smirk on her face, asked if she hadn't expected it. Mary was taken aback for a moment. She looked at the young lady and wondered how long she had been there. She thought that most likely the young lady had seen her bullying that maid. She was very strong, scared, and did not understand why the lady was so friendly. She felt very uncomfortable around the young lady. Trembling with fear, she looked at the young miss and said that if she had something to say, then she listened to her. Liz said with a satisfied smile that of course she would like to talk to her. She looked down and noticed her sister. With lightning speed, the young lady took the maid by the hands and with a satisfied smile said that she was very glad of their chance meeting. She smiled and thanked the maid. The maid looked at the little mistress in bewilderment. The young lady smiled and told the maid that she had just saved her. The maid froze in place in surprise. She did not understand what was happening. A moment later, the young lady let go of her hands and flew downwards. At the same time, the Duchess, frozen in place, watched as her sister fell down the stairs. With the speed of lightning, she came to her senses and quickly rushed to her sister. The young lady, in turn, knew that she must not smile, otherwise, everyone would immediately understand that she was pretending. She looked at her sister in surprise because she knew that her cries expressed all her anxiety and all her love. She knew that this was what she needed. The Duchess was in shock as she held her little sister's body in her arms. She knew that her sister was the most beautiful and brightest in the world. Liz stood frozen for a moment, looking at her sister. She didn't know if she was angry or about to cry. She knew perfectly well that she would hardly ever see her love so clearly again. She understood perfectly well that all she could do was enjoy this moment. She looked closely at her sister and quietly asked with tears in her eyes if she really was an unnecessary, illegitimate child for her. Liz knew that when they went shopping together recently, she had told her that she shouldn't forget how important she was to her. Liz sighed heavily and told her sister in her mind not to worry, as she would never forget that. A moment later, the young lady pointed her finger at her assailant. She knew she would never allow anyone to hurt her again. The Duchess, in her turn, looked up in surprise, but a moment later her face changed. She was furious. Liz, in turn, was jubilant. She was glad because she understood that she had won this battle. She lay quietly in her sister's arms and enjoyed them. The maid was seized by the knights with lightning speed. Some time later, Bella burst into her mistress's room and called her. The doctor looked closely at the maid and told her to be quiet. As he was leaving, the doctor said that the Duchess was now making a decision regarding that maid. He asked Bella to look after the young lady because he needed to go get some medicine. Bella, trembling with fear, said that she would do everything. The doctor was in shock. He did not understand how the maid could be so cruel to the young lady. Bella, in turn, frozen in shock, stood quietly next to the mistress. A moment later, Bella leaned over her mistress's bed and called her name. The young lady opened her eyes and looked closely at her maid. She asked Bella with a smile how she knew she was awake. Liz looked closely at her maid and said with a smile that she was very attentive. Bella, in turn, was trembling with fear. She could not utter a word. The young lady looked at her maid with a radiant smile and asked if she was faithful to her. Bella, trembling with fear, said quietly that she was faithful to her mistress. The young lady said with a smile that she gave a quick answer, and that was very good. Bella thought for a moment and remembered the moment when she saw the young lady in the Duchess's arms. Bella was in shock as she unfortunately did not manage to prevent the disaster, and the young lady was hurt. She froze in shock when she saw the young lady smiling a predatory smile. The young lady looked at her maid and said with a smile that she liked her very much, so she could continue to work like that. Bella froze in surprise for a moment. She was in shock, as she did not expect to hear something like that. Liz looked at her maid intently and asked with a smile if she understood her. The young lady was in shock. She promised to protect her sister and do everything to make her feel good, but now she was puzzled as she understood that she had failed in this task. The doctor looked closely at the Duchess and said that what happened today was simply inhumane. He sighed heavily and said that the best thing they could do for the young mistress was to punish the maid severely and try to prevent such an incident from happening again. He looked at the Duchess intently and said that at such moments one must show greater firmness. The Duchess, in turn, sighed heavily because she knew that he was right. She knew that she simply could not forgive herself for her carelessness. She knew that this world was a living fantasy for her, which is why she was overconfident that she could handle everything. The Duchess was puzzled because she understood that her sister almost died. She understood that what was happening was going beyond all bounds, and she realized this only after her sister had suffered several times. She was very angry with herself. She herself knew very well that feeling when she was pierced by a blade several times. Better than anyone else, she knew what betrayal was. The man asked her furiously what it was like to be defenseless. He asked if she should have given in and surrendered already. The madam told the young lady that she seemed to have caught star fever, and she was already terribly ashamed to meet with friends. She looked at everyone present and said that they must understand that Liz was her dearest person, and she regarded this as an attempted murder. She looked at her knight intently and said that she ordered the saleswoman from the studio and the maid to be punished in the most severe manner. The Duchess looked hard at the doctor and asked him to stay for a moment. He looked at her in surprise, but still stayed. The young lady sighed heavily and told the doctor that she wanted to talk about his words. She looked at him intently and said that he had told her himself before that Pierrot's herb was only safe for saints and special magicians. She looked at him intently and asked what special magicians were like. He thought for a moment, not knowing whether to answer her question. He sighed heavily and asked if she knew that everything in the world exists in balance. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The doctor looked at her intently and said that they could start with the fact that it is extremely difficult to meet a wizard, and in fact nothing is known about them. He looked at her intently and said that everything has its opposite, and magic is no exception. He thought for a moment and said that the Archduke's pair of magic would be water magic. He looked at her intently and said that, unfortunately, he had no idea why only he had purple mana out of the average fire mage's Rachel. In turn thought for a moment, as she knew that the color of fire mana was red. He said that among all the varieties of magic, they say there is one that cleanses evil. It is wielded by the magic of light. The Duchess asked in surprise, "Is it really not very different from divine power?" He sighed heavily and said that this was not so, because these are different things. Divine power is the power of God, and magic is the power of people. The main purpose of divine power is to heal life energy, and light mages destroy filth. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. He said that only once, in the long history of the Empire, was there a record of how the light max purified the poison of the Pierrot grass. She looked at the doctor in surprise, held him side, and said that unfortunately there were no more records, and there was nothing about the dark mages either, so it was very difficult to find out more about them. Rachel sighed heavily. She knew that nothing was said about this in the original, so she didn't know anything either, but for a moment she thought about the purification. She understood that if this was her power, then something evil was tormenting the Archduke. She sighed heavily as she realized that her hands were simply a tranquilizer for the tyrant. She was puzzled, as she thought that she had simply read too many novels. She was puzzled because for some reason she had wanted nothing to do with that man from the very beginning. She sighed heavily because she now realized the whole reality. The young lady was shocked, as she already clearly saw her difficult future on the horizon. She knew that the Archduke's curse had to be kept a closely guarded secret. She understood that for this reason, all sorts of conspiracies were hidden in such stories. The doctor looked closely at the young lady, and he, in turn, very much hoped that she would cope with everything that was happening. The Duchess looked at her sister and asked her with a gentle smile if she could get up, as she only wanted to apply some healing ointment to her. She smiled and told her sister that she could then go to bed. The Duchess looked at her sister and said with a smile that she was only trying to make sure that there was no scar left on her face. She looked closely at her sister and, with tears in her eyes, asked her for forgiveness. She kissed her sister tenderly and thanked her for remaining safe and sound. The Duchess was in shock. She said she just didn't know what would have happened to her if she had suffered even worse. Liz looked at her sister with tears in her eyes and said that when she cried, her heart broke. The Duchess noticed that her sister was simply a charming child. Today, she suddenly imagined what it would be like if she completely retained her appearance in the original history, along with her stern look. The Duchess understood perfectly well that in that case, her sister would have defeated the villain with her own hands, but she did not want to return to such thoughts at all. She knew perfectly well that she would have loved her sister in any case. She knew perfectly well that this strong wall was built from bricks, usually made of endless wounds, and covered with wood. Liz looked at her sister intently and asked if she had forgotten what you said last time. The Duchess looked at her sister and said with a smile that she loved her more than anyone in the world. She smiled and told her sister that it was time for her to go to bed, and also wished her sweet dreams. The young lady smiled and also wished her sister sweet dreams. Liz also loved her sister very much more than anyone in the world. The young man mocked his dead brother, saying that he would make sure that not a trace of his soul remained. He looked at his brother with a fierce grin and said that he was now the emperor. He looked closely at his nephew and told him not to shake because he had taken his place on merit. He looked at his nephew intently and said that he would not deprive him of the throne. He looked at the boy with fury and said that when he looked at him again, he realized that he was an exact copy of his older brother, Edvik von Castor. The crown prince of the empire froze in shock. The emperor looked at the young man with fury and said that he had the same hair and eyes as his father. He was furious because he felt as if he was being mocked. He looked at the crown prince with disdain and pushed him away with lightning speed. He ordered the servants to lock the crown prince in the closed palace. The emperor, in turn, wondered whether he should make an idiot out of the crown prince. With the poison that the elder brother used, he understood very well that if he left the heir in that palace, no one would dare to say anything to him. He understood that now there was no one above him. He understood perfectly well that in the current empire, he was the emperor. The Archduke slowly approached the man and asked if he was the next emperor. With lightning speed, the emperor turned around and froze in place. He was furious and did not understand who this man was, who dared to address him so casually. He did not understand how he got into their palace. The Archduke looked at the emperor intently and casually said that he was proposing to make a deal. The young man ran up to the emperor and, asking for forgiveness, said that the Archduke had entered the palace of his own free will. The emperor looked at the Archduke with fury. He asked if he really didn't know a damn thing ruling a small piece of land. He didn't understand how he, an insignificant Archduke, dared to offer him a deal to the emperor. His assistant was taken aback and called the emperor. The emperor looked at the Archduke with rage and said that after ascending the throne, he would first of all replace the Archduke. The emperor shouted that the young man was nothing special. The emperor shouted furiously to his servants to immediately throw this duke out of the palace. But the Archduke would not tolerate such a thing. He used his magic with lightning speed. The emperor froze in shock. He didn't expect to see such magic. The Archduke looked at the emperor with cold fury and asked if he was now ready for conversation. The emperor froze in place from shock and surprise. He did not understand what was happening and what feeling enveloped him. The Archduke sighed heavily and told the emperor to simply give him the battlefield under a specious pretext, and then his flames would not turn towards the empire. The emperor stood frozen in surprise, unable to speak, wondering if he was really scared. He looked closely at the ashes that were next to him, who had once been a man. The Archduke looked at the emperor with cold fury and said that he should have answered already. The emperor stood frozen in shock and trembling. He gave a positive answer to the Archduke, but a moment later, the emperor looked at the young man with a fierce grin and said that in return, he wanted the Archduke to be at his side at every victory reception, since he was the emperor who had seized power into his own hands. The emperor looked at the young man intently and said that, unfortunately, he had no solid ground under his feet. The Archduke, in turn, burst out laughing, looking at the emperor. The emperor looked at the young man in surprise. The Archduke looked at him intently and said with a smile that although he was trembling, he still spoke to him. Theo, with a smile, said that he should still acknowledge his bravery. He looked intently at the emperor and said that their deal was made. and now this was his empire. The emperor looked closely at his nephew and asked if he remembered the day he first wore the imperial crown, when he overthrew his father, an incompetent former emperor. The emperor said with malice in his voice that that day should have been the best and happiest in his life, but everything turned out differently. Looking at his nephew, he asked if he wanted to know why everything happened that way. The emperor said angrily that he had simply realized that neither his pathetic father nor the previous ignorant emperors had been able to control the archduke. At the same time, the crown prince trembled with fear when the emperor spoke such words. The emperor threw food at his nephew in anger. He was very angry because with the arrogance that was present, he dared to ignore his emperor of an entire country. The emperor shouted that no one would like this. The crown prince looked at his uncle and said that he understood this. The emperor looked at his nephew with a grin and told him to repeat who he was again. The crown prince sighed heavily and looking at the emperor said with a puzzled expression that he was the majestic emperor. The archduke in turn sighed heavily and turned his gaze away from the crown prince. The crown prince took a step back in confusion and said that his uncle was the emperor of the entire Castor Empire. The emperor looked at the crown prince with fury and said that the archduke had caused a whole commotion and he had not deigned to apologize to the emperor and was still wandering around wherever he wanted. The crown prince sighed heavily and said that he was ready to receive punishment. He looked at the emperor intently and said that he was ready to do it instead of his incompetent predecessors. The emperor looked at the prince with a grin and said that he saw that he had learned the previous lesson. He said that someone still had to pay for the sins of previous generations. A moment later, the emperor ordered his servants to take the prince, and later they should beat him and lock him in a closed palace. For a week, the prince sighed heavily. He wanted everything to end as soon as possible. A whole week had passed since this incident. The young duchess was very glad that her sister was not seriously hurt. She looked closely at her sister and was glad that she was quickly getting better. She knew she would never tell her sister this, but before she came to this world, her own world was gray and gloomy. She understood perfectly well that no one had ever defended her, and everyone only assessed her talent. She was subjected to malicious remarks and criticism, which became an integral part of her life. She was repeatedly pierced by caustic, sharp, copy-like comments that deeply hurt her heart. From the bleeding wound, along with her self-confidence, her very existence flowed out. She was afraid that someone would see her. She was very worried and afraid that they would start pointing fingers at her and criticizing her. Before going out, she dressed in such a way that she was unrecognizable and avoided contact with people in every possible way. She knew that unfortunately, a person cannot live alone. The young lady understood perfectly well that she had to drag out her existence thanks to her light. And deep down, she hoped that her sister would finally meet her soulmate, and her world would become brighter, and her vision would become wider. She, in turn, wondered if her thoughts were not too carefree despite all this. She sighed heavily as she realized it would be vain of her to think that way. She wondered if she could handle it all like her sister in the novel. The young lady, in turn, was very worried that she might make a mistake by referring to the plot of this novel. Liz looked at her sister intently and called her. The Duchess was taken aback as she was reading a book and lost in her own thoughts. She apologized to her sister and said that she was just lost in thought. She smiled and asked her sister where she was. The Duchess decided to tell a few stories about the twins before introducing them to her sister. She sighed heavily and knew that the twins would be disappointed, but she decided to go to the Duke alone next time. She looked closely at her sister and asked with a smile if it was true that the twins looked like two peas in a pod. Rachel looked at her sister with a smile and said that everything was exactly like that, but if you looked closely, you could find a lot of differences. Liz looked at her sister intently and said that she would like to see the twins. She asked her sister if she could see them. The Duchess looked at her sister in surprise, as she had not expected anything like this at all. Taken aback, the Duchess asked her sister if she really wanted to meet them. Looking at her sister, she said that the twins were very wonderful and sweet, so they could become friends. Liz looked at her sister with a smile and agreed with her. She knew that if she made her sister happy, then she would be happy too. The young lady, in turn, was lost in her thoughts. She thought it was very strange. She knew that this was the only place where she could see him, and it was a victory reception. The young ladies, in turn, discussed what had actually happened at the Marquise's residence. They were interested in how it all began. They knew that the Marquis had challenged the Duchess. They knew it was true, and they also knew that the Archduke himself had stood up for the young Duchess and acted as her knight. Caroline was furious at what she heard. She knew that this was the main problem. Now those present, in turn, discussed the fact that the Archduke acted as a knight. Miss Murray looked at everyone present with a smile and said that it was very romantic. The young ladies were amazed. They did not expect to hear such a thing from her. She looked at everyone present and asked with a smile if they had already started dating. Caroline froze in rage and didn't answer. A moment later, the young lady burst into tears in full view of everyone. The young man rushed towards the young lady with lightning speed. He wanted to calm her down and cheer her up. A moment later, everyone's eyes were fixed on young Miss Murray. Miss, in turn, froze in place. The young people told her that it was not so, but on her part she knew how deep Caroline's feelings for the Archduke were. They said that at first glance, you wouldn't say that the Viscount's daughter was so inattentive. They said that it seemed that she had not been taught to think first and then speak. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Caroline looked intently at the young lady. A moment later, she sighed heavily and asked the young men not to attack the young lady so harshly. She sighed heavily and said that she knew that the day might come when the Archduke would look at someone else. The young lady sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, it was entirely her fault that she was not prepared for something like this. Miss sighed heavily and, taken aback, said that it was she who had made a mistake. She asked her for forgiveness. Caroline, in turn, looked closely at everyone present and said that she unfortunately was not feeling well, so she had to leave them. The young man told the young lady that if she was not feeling well, she could leave, and they would wait for her at the next event. Caroline thanked him and with lightning speed walked to the exit. The young lady, in turn, called Caroline, but she did not answer her. All those present looked sideways and angrily at the young lady. They said she was tactless towards Caroline. They all felt sorry for Caroline. The maid looked closely at her mistress and said in surprise that she had come very early. Caroline sighed heavily and told her maid that it was time for them to return home. The maid was surprised and shouted to her mistress that they should go together. The young lady, in turn, was furious. She knew that she couldn't just leave it like that. The young lady asked the maid if she could convey to her father a request to send a red rose to the Viscount. The maid was a little surprised, as she did not expect such a thing, but she shouted to her mistress that she would do everything. The young lady looked at her maid intently and said that she must tell her father that she would be dropping in to see him for a moment, as they had a matter to settle. The man looked at his daughter closely and asked if she was asking to be given a place next to the Archduke. The young lady smiled and told her father that it was indeed so. She asked her father if it was possible given his capabilities. The Duke frowned for a moment, not knowing what to answer. He wondered if his daughter would really be married to someone who was difficult for even the Emperor to deal with. He knew it was a very attractive idea, but the Archduke was a very dangerous young man. He understood perfectly well that no matter how much he wanted to obtain this power, it would only be meaningful when he could calmly control it. He understood perfectly well that the Archduke was not someone who could be known in a corner, and rather he himself used others and threw them away as unnecessary. He looked intently at his daughter because he did not understand why, out of such a huge number of men, her gaze fell on the Archduke. She looked at her father intently and said that it was better this way than to give him to the Duchess. He looked at his daughter in surprise and asked if she really thought that a boy who, like a eunuch, had never been interested in women, would suddenly start an affair with such a woman. He, in his own way, hid the emperor's dirty deeds and demonstratively showed his loyalty to him. Thus he managed to gain power which became the core of their family. He understood perfectly well that no matter how you looked at it, the strength of the imperial faction was great, and for this reason, the emergence of opposition was inevitable. He knew perfectly well that it had previously been the former Duke Agnus. He knew that his family had earned their success, so their house was different from the ancient line of the Duke. He knew that they had quite a long history, and powerful forces followed them. The Duke knew perfectly well that they were worth nothing now. His presentation was done with precision. He knew he wouldn't get caught if it was revealed really. But he was very worried that the young Duchess might ask the Archduke to avenge her family. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and asked if she was sure she could handle it. The young lady smiled and said that if the Duchess could do it, then she could do it too. The Duke, in turn, knew perfectly well that his daughter was the ideal type of personal flower, and many men had declared that they would sacrifice their lives for her. He knew perfectly well that now that it had become known that the Archduke had an interest in women, his efforts could pay off. The Duke looked intently at his beloved daughter and said that he would like to speak to her about the Viscount's family. He said that she would never meet them again because he sent them a red rose. The young lady looked at her father with a smirk and said that she was very sorry because the young lady was a very beautiful girl. The Duchess looked at her sister closely and said with a joyful smile that she was simply charming. With the speed of lightning, she hugged her sister tightly. The young miss sighed heavily and told her sister that she couldn't breathe. The Duchess looked at her closely, as every time she applied the ointment to her wound, a scab would form on it. She noticed that her wound was healing quickly. She was glad that everything had turned out well after all. She looked at her sister intently and said with a happy smile that she was beautiful. The Duchess said that it was time for them to go. Liz looked at her sister intently and said with a smile that she would like to see the twins soon. The Duchess looked at her sister. She knew she was very beautiful and wondered what she would do if one of the boys fell in love with her. She activated her imagination mode. She knew that Noel was immediately eliminated from the list of presidents. She knew that he was the one who would fall head over heels in love with the saint and help destroy her sister's army. The Duchess, in turn, was a little puzzled. Rachel knew that Jael was innocent, so she could pass judgment on him a little later. She thought for a moment, for she knew it would be very nice if the Duke's twins fell in love with her sister. She looked at her sister with a smile, because she understood that it would be nice if not only they fell in love with her, she hoped that the future protagonist of the novel would also give her his heart. A moment later, she was taken aback as she realized that the novel's protagonist was completely unsuitable for the role of her sister's lover. She understood perfectly well that it was the main characters who were the culprit of her suicide. The young lady looked at her sister intently. She knew there was no way she would let him do this. She was furious and knew she needed to keep the crown prince away from her sister. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that no matter how high she rose, no matter how strong she was, and no matter what power she had, the label of an illegitimate child would follow her everywhere like a long train. The Marquis shouted to the Emperor with a grin that a bastard had come to the banquet, and that this was an insult to the members of the imperial family. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Marquis with a smirk. She wondered if he too wanted to say a few strong words to her. She knew that there was nothing surprising in this. After all imperials were the same. The Emperor looked at the Marquis with a grin and asked what was wrong with him. He said that in front of him now stood an emperor who had spent half his life locked up like a wild animal. He asked the Marquis if he wasn't now giving the dirtiest comments. The Marquis looked at the Emperor in surprise and shouted that this was not funny at all. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in surprise. She did not understand what had just happened. She stared at the departing emperor and wondered if he had really spent half his life locked up. She knew that this fact made him even more brilliant. She really wanted him to be hers. The Duchess, in turn, understood perfectly well that it was he who helped her sister to know herself. She understood that a man who knew how to listen and a person who had gone through many difficulties was the best option for her sister. The Duchess, in turn, understood perfectly well that the most important thing was that the young man did not hurt her sister. She knew that if someone appeared on her path, before she would grind him into dust. The Duchess, in turn, wondered what the main character was doing now. She knew that the heroine would only appear in a few years, and now she probably lived somewhere among the common people. The Duke greeted the young ladies with a smile. The Duchess, in turn, sighed heavily. She really wanted the main character not to go out yet. The very thought of the heroine surrounded by love made her feel sick. She wondered if it was all because of her low self-esteem. The Duke looked intently at the Duchess and called her. She was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. He looked at her in surprise and asked if there was something she didn't like. He smiled and said that perhaps he should have taken care of her safety from the very beginning. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he didn't need to bother his head with such nonsense, since she was just thinking. He looked at her with concern and asked if she had really thought about the rumors that were written in the newspaper. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that the rumors about the Archduke's attack on the Duchess had reached the Duke's family's estate. She understood perfectly well that now was not the best time to be distracted by extraneous thoughts. She knew that since the rumors had reached the Duke, she would not be at all surprised if they sent her a wreath of condolences. She sighed heavily, knowing that she had to stop wandering in her thoughts immediately. A moment later, she greeted them with a radiant smile and introduced her sister. She looked closely at her sister and with a smile told her to greet the young people. A moment later, the young lady made a graceful curtsy with an embarrassed smile. The twins, in turn, froze for a moment. They were struck by the beauty of the young lady. The Archduke, in turn, cleared his throat and called his grandchildren. He looked at them intently and with a smile suggested to the Duchess that the children be given the opportunity to spend time together. He smiled and said that they could do their own thing. The Duchess looked at him with a smile and agreed. She said that she just needed to discuss something with him. The Duchess, in turn, looked closely at the twins and with a smile asked them to take care of her young sister. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had heard in general terms what had happened at the Marquise's residence. He asked the young Duchess if the Archduke had really used his magic on her. The young Duchess, in turn, only laughed. Rachel knew perfectly well that the Archduke's curse was a great secret, and it was not to her advantage to report that she was able to help him. She sighed heavily and said that everything was too complicated, and she could only say that the Archduke had no intention of harming her. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that it was too tactless of him to say such words, but if he had had such intentions, she would already be dead. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and was taken aback but did not answer. The Duke looked closely at the young Duchess and asked with a smile if she would like to get to the main point. She smiled and looked at him intently as she was ready to begin negotiations. Some time later, the young people were in the greenhouse of the ducal residence. The young man looked closely at the young lady and with a smile invited her to sit down. Liz looked at the young man in surprise and slowly sat down at the small table. She sighed heavily as she felt a little uncomfortable with them staring at her like that. The twins, in turn, looked intently at the young lady, not taking their eyes off her. She sighed heavily as this greatly irritated and strained her. A moment later, she turned and looked at them intently, not taking her eyes off them. The young man looked away from her in embarrassment and asked why she was looking at them like that. The young lady sighed heavily, and her expression changed with lightning speed. She looked at them with a smile and said that they looked like idiots. The twins froze in surprise. They looked intently at the young lady and asked what she was talking about. Liz looked at them intently and said that she really hoped that in the future they would no longer invite her and her sister to visit, and thus they would save them unnecessary trouble. They looked at her in surprise, as they did not expect this. The young man looked at her with anger and asked why she was behaving like this. He asked with anger if she didn't like the fact that they were twins either. The young lady in turn looked at them in surprise. A moment later she asked what he was saying. She was a little puzzled by his question. They knew very well that the idea of separating twins was only popular among the nobles. The young man sighed heavily and said that it seemed that was not the case. He looked at her closely and with tears in his eyes asked if she could tell them the real reason. He said that if she didn't like the type of face, they would definitely call the gardener, and he would fix the landscape. And if she didn't like the desserts, they would tell the cook to redo everything. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, they didn't have friends among their peers, so they didn't know how to behave. The young lady looked at them intently and said with a smirk that they didn't need to know that. Some time later, they sat and ate in silence. Noel looked closely at the young lady and said that they had been informed that the Duchess's younger sister was beautiful and kind. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that she only resembled the Duchess in appearance. The young lady thought for a moment. Looking at one of the twins, she asked if he was saying that she looked like her sister. He looked at her intently and said that it was also because she had silver hair like her sister and a sweet face. The young lady was taken aback and froze in surprise. She remembered the first time she touched her sister's hair, and she was very worried that if she touched it again, she would get it dirty. Rachel looked at her sister with a beaming smile and said that it was okay, and she could touch them as much as she wanted. She also said that they were the same size. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that her sister was a very busy person, and she did not want to waste time that she could spend with her on the twins. But she sighed heavily and said that she did not mind. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at them intently and said that only occasionally did she allow them to come and visit her. Noel looked at her in surprise and asked with a smile if it was true. With lightning speed, he thanked her. He smiled and said that he would try his best to cheer her up. For some time after, the young man followed the young lady like a dog on a leash. His brother, in turn, froze in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. She looked closely at her sister and asked with a smile if she liked it. She asked her sister if she wanted to visit them again. Liz, with a smile, said that they agreed that the twins would come to visit them next time. The Duchess smiled and asked her sister if they had already become friends. She said with a gentle smile that she was already starting to get jealous. Liz, in turn, just laughed. The Duchess sighed heavily, as she knew that deep down she wanted to be the most special person to her sister. She knew that it was now the end of summer, and the rainy season in the duchy had already ended, so it was the perfect time to build. She knew that workers would be clearing the road and sidewalks during the day, and Liz, in turn, was very glad that their conversation ended on a good note. The Duchess knew that if the imperial house and the Archduke's family were excluded, the privileged right to negotiate with the Nas family was now hers. The Duchess, in turn, made no effort to gain the Duke's favor. She only saved his grandson, and now he showed great interest in her. Of course, she knew that this was not the only thing that allowed the deal to be successfully concluded. If in exchange for the kindness shown, she had offered something absurd, their relationship would have been disposable. She understood that he was satisfied with her sincerity. She was glad that everything was going according to her plan. She knew perfectly well that her duchy would become incredibly rich in the near future. She knew that she would certainly achieve this. Rupert looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to be very tired. Rachel smiled and said that it was true, because it was her first long trip. She looked closely at her sister and asked the knight to carry her to the room. The Duchess looked at the knight and asked how things were going with the training of the knightly order. Liv sighed and said that it turned out that they were very angry with themselves because of the one who had lost consciousness. Then he said that they had all become disciplined. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily. She knew that what had happened in spring had been a huge shock to the knights. and she was also surprised. She wondered if this was the main reason why the knight captain had decided to personally take charge of training the accompanying knights. She sighed heavily and said that it wasn't their fault. It was just that the enemy had acted meanly, although she didn't know if her words would be any consolation to them. She looked intently at the knight and said that since they were having this conversation, she had one question for him. She looked at him intently and asked who he thought would win if he fought the Archduke without using magic. Rupert thought for a moment. He said that unfortunately, he had never seen the Archduke wield a sword. The Duchess was taken aback for a moment and thought as she saw that her knight was very serious about his answer. The young knight was suddenly overcome with memories. He remembered his first meeting with the Archduke. He sighed heavily and said that he would fight and try to win with all his might. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She was surprised because he didn't have a clear answer. She wondered if this was the future sword master speaking. You said that, as far as he remembered, the Archduke had always had a murderous spirit, and he was also strong in spirit. He sighed heavily and said that a knight with such characteristics, once he reached a certain level, could intimidate others, and the Archduke was able to do this even at a young age. The young lady stood there in surprise for a moment, wondering if he was really that good, and suddenly memories of their past encounters came flooding back to her. He looked hard at the lady and said that he could not say for sure that it would be his defeat. He looked at the Duchess intently and said that he would protect her with his own life. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and froze in place in shock. A moment later she laughed and, looking at him, said that he was truly an honest, loyal, and indomitable knight. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the Archduke would never point his sword at her. He would only protect her, and all for the sake of neutralizing the curse that had been destroying the young perfectionist since his youth. The Archduke looked at the knight with fury and shouted for him to open the door immediately. With the speed of lightning, he entered the room where the Emperor was sitting with his guests. The knight looked closely at the Archduke and told him to stop for safety. All those present looked at him warily. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with embarrassment. The knight was frightened. He asked the Archduke to stop. Theo looked at him mockingly and asked if he would draw his sword. The knight froze for a moment and asked what he was talking about. Theo looked at him with cold fury and told him to think carefully before taking such a step. He looked at the knight intently and said that if he was ready to stop him, he could take out his weapon. The knight backed away, not knowing what to do. The Emperor looked intently at everyone present and told them to leave. The knights began to object, but the Emperor insisted. He said that they would be fine and they could leave them. A moment later, the Archduke was given the place where he was to sit. The Emperor looked at the Archduke intently and said that he knew what was troubling him, but still asked him to calm his anger. The young lady, in turn, did not take her gaze off the Archduke. The Emperor looked at him intently and asked if he had forgotten about their precious guests. The Archduke looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady, in turn, began to speak, as she wanted the Archduke to listen to her. Theo, in turn, did not let her say a word. He said that this was complete nonsense. The Emperor looked at the young man and said that he had called him here for his own reasons. He looked at them and asked how much longer they would ignore each other. Theo looked at everyone present with cold fury. The Emperor smiled and said that they could at least exchange greetings.